Hello. Welcome to the channel if you're new, and welcome back if you're a regular. Tell me where you're from and what time you're listening. Now get comfy and let's begin. When I was 7, my parents got divorced. My older brother was 9 at the time, and after the split, my mom got full custody. We'd only see our dad every other weekend. My mom worked as a waitress, so money was tight and we struggled a lot. Because of this, we moved around constantly, always getting evicted from one place or another. When I was around 10, we finally settled in a house in a rough neighborhood. Despite the neighborhood, it was the biggest and nicest place we'd ever lived in. It was also much cheaper than any of the other places we'd stayed in. But there was something off about this house. Strange things would happen all the time. For example, the TV in the living room would randomly turn itself on and off. One night, my brother and I were lying on the couch in the living room, trying to sleep. We'd done this a lot before, but this time the TV switched on while we were dozing off. Annoyed, I got up and unplugged it, then sleepily settled back into the couch. A little while later, I heard the faint crackle of the TV turning on again. I got up, intending to unplug it once more, only to realize I had already done so. I panicked and pressed the power button to turn it off. Needless to say, I didn't get much sleep that night. A few months later, I was lying in my bed, not trying to sleep, just thinking. It was quiet in the room when suddenly, I heard a tap on my window. It wasn't a knock, more like the soft tap you'd make with the tip of your finger. I jumped out of bed, ran to my brother's room, and frantically turned on his light, trying to explain what had just happened. I begged him to let me sleep in his room because I was too scared to stay alone. He agreed, and I climbed into his bed. But after a moment of silence, we both heard the same 2 taps on his window. Without a word, we jumped up and ran to our mom's room. We were crying as we told her what had happened, but she was irritated because we had woken her up. She sighed and told us we were probably imagining things and to go back to bed. But then, right after she spoke, the same tapping sound echoed on her window. My mom shot up out of bed and told us we could stay with her that night. Somehow, we all managed to fall asleep without any more disturbances, but it was unsettling. One summer, when my brother and I were off from school, my mom worked from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. During that time, we were left at home with her boyfriend. He was a good guy, but mostly just slept all day, staying up late at night. One morning, my brother and I were playing a game of hide-and-seek tag, being as quiet as we could so we wouldn't wake him. I was the seeker and found my brother, but before I could tag him, he jumped up and ran outside. I chased him, shutting the door behind me. After a quick round around the house, my brother returned inside, stopped at the door, and I tagged him, laughing and saying, "You're it." My brother looked at me, confused, and I asked what was wrong. He stared at the door and said, "It's locked." I thought he was just messing with me, but when I tried to open it, I realized he was right. It wasn't just the handle, it was the deadbolt, which could only be locked from the inside. We ran to my mom's bedroom and started banging on the window, trying to wake up her boyfriend, but he was a heavy sleeper and didn't hear us. Hours passed before my mom came home and finally let us back inside. She also told me that there were nights when she was in bed and would hear my brother screaming for her, saying he had just seen something terrifying. She'd rush to his room, only to realize we were at our dad's house for the weekend. This happened more than once. One night, around 3 a.m., we were all asleep when we were suddenly jolted awake by a loud crash coming from the storage room. We tiptoed out of our rooms and found all of our Christmas ornaments shattered across the floor. We'd been living in that house for over 6 months by then, and the storage tubs had always been neatly stacked. We didn't have any animals that could have knocked them over, and the carpeted floor made the situation even stranger since the ornaments should have just rolled, not shattered. We cleaned up the mess and tried to go back to sleep. The last strange incident in that house happened while we were on vacation. My mom had a friend who didn't have a home of his own and would hop between couches, so we stayed at his place while we were away. About halfway through the week, my mom got a text from him that said, "I'm sorry, but I can't stay here anymore." She walked into another room and called him. After their conversation, she explained to us that he had been sitting on her bed with the door cracked open when he heard a noise. He looked through the crack and saw a little girl staring back at him. Thinking he was imagining things, he got up to check, and when he opened the door, he saw her run away from him. She was wearing a white dress and appeared to be laughing, almost as if she wanted to play hide and seek with him. That was enough for him to pack up and leave, and we never saw him again. We eventually moved out of that house, and nothing strange happened after that. Surprisingly, we still know the people who live there now. They've mentioned experiencing some weird things, but they never went into detail. Honestly, I'm just relieved I'm not living there anymore. I've had 2 separate Thanksgivings ruined by stalkers, each about 5 years apart. The first one happened when I was alarmingly young, 13 years old. He was 12 and we had math class together. Everyone at school knew that he had a massive crush on me, which wouldn't have been a problem on its own. But this kid was also the most inappropriate person I've ever met. I know that's a strong statement for a 12-year-old, but it became a huge issue at our school for a while. He'd try to sneak peeks up girls' skirts or grab them in the hallways. He even got caught trying to sneak into the girls' locker room with one of those old flip phones that had a camera. I don't know how he managed to get away with just a few weeks suspension for that. Needless to say, when I rejected his advances, he began harassing me. He'd wait for me at my locker every day, whispering creepy things as I walked past. It was the kind of stuff that I can't even write here, it was that bad. He started following me to class too. Somehow, he figured out my schedule and started tracking me around school. I told my teachers, the school counselor, the vice principal, nothing happened. The best they could do was switch my classes to make it harder for him to find me, but that only worked for a week. After that, he began following me out to the bus. Eventually, he figured out my class schedule, bus number, student ID, and was on the verge of finding my home address and phone number. It was right when I was about to lose it that he asked me out again. It wasn't just out of spite for being rejected. It seemed like he truly believed that harassing me would somehow convince me to date him. This went on for months, starting at the beginning of the semester and continuing up until Thanksgiving. By then, I was so scared, exhausted, and angry that I screamed "no" in his face. He looked taken aback for a second, but then his true colors showed. He told me he was coming over to my house on Thanksgiving and that he was bringing a gun to kill me and my whole family. At first, I didn't believe him, but I knew he had access to a gun. I had already told my math teacher about him, and a few days later, the cops went to his house to check on him, to assess his thinking, as they put it, and thank God it was just an airsoft gun, and he was obviously just intending to scare me. But if he'd have shown up with that thing, I know for a fact that my dad would have just blasted him without checking if it was real or not. I thought the school would finally expel him after that, and thankfully, that was the final straw for the principal who had him transferred to a school for kids with behavioral problems shortly after. That was nearly almost 20 years ago now, and I live on the other side of the country, so I'm not too worried about him finding me. But it definitely stuck with me for a long while and seriously colored my opinion in men in a distinctly negative way. My second stalker was a guy I dated in high school. Since we were headed to different colleges, I broke up with him just after graduation, and he basically just went nuts over it, like actual clinical nervous breakdown type thing. I think that was just leftover stress from the SATs or how I sort of started to compartmentalize it at first. He got worse and worse as the months went by though. And finally, when I traveled home for Thanksgiving, I tried breaking into my mom's house while we were both asleep upstairs. He stalked me almost everywhere I went, and so I could put together some actual evidence of what he was doing. The cops couldn't do a freaking thing. When I got a new car, he called my work from the business next door and told me my new license plate. He was just relentless. One night, he called my house like every minute, on the minute for almost an hour straight. My parents had to unplug all the phones to get some peace, and my dad called the cops from his cell phone. This all came to a head when he attacked me one day when I was walking downtown that same Thanksgiving weekend. I was with a friend at the time, and he must have gotten a visit from the cops and assumed it was me that called them. He hit me so hard that he almost fractured my orbital socket. And finally, he went to jail for a few months, and that gave me a way out. I moved an hour away, changed my number, got a new job, and blocked him on any social media I had in addition to lockdown privacy settings. He's moved to a different town and is still wildly unstable. My life has gotten so much better, and I've had so many positive changes, and I hope he never hears about any of it. But there's definitely a little piece of my trauma that I'm not able to let go of. Stuff that just changed you, and you're left constantly looking over your shoulder, carrying a taser, always ready to fight if that one nightmarish person turns up in your life again, because I know that if he does find me again, he won't give me another chance to get away. He'll kill me. I know he will. So I always have to be ready. The crackling of our campfire barely cut through the heavy, unnerving silence that had settled over the forest. What was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway for Sarah and me had quickly morphed into something far more unsettling. As I stared into the darkness just beyond the reach of our campfire's light, the sense that we were being watched clung to me, unshakable. Little did I know, our peaceful camping trip was about to become a desperate battle for survival. I'm Alex, and I've always been a lover of the outdoors. When I suggested to my girlfriend, Sarah, that we spend our anniversary weekend camping, she was excited. We chose a secluded spot deep in the Ozarks, miles away from the usual tourist paths. We were after solitude, a chance to reconnect with nature and with each other. Be careful what you wish for, right? The first day went perfectly. We hiked through dense forests, the trees above alive with the sounds of birds. We set up camp in a small clearing near a bubbling stream, the soft gurgle of the water providing a soothing soundtrack to our quiet conversations. As night fell, we sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and gazing at the stars above. But it was on the second day that things began to feel wrong. We were exploring a ridge nearby when Sarah suddenly stopped. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice tense. I paused and listened, but all I could hear was the usual symphony of the forest. "Hear what?" "I thought I heard voices," she replied, her eyes scanning the trees. "Like someone shouting," she added. I strained my ears but still heard nothing out of the ordinary. "Probably just other hikers," I said, trying to ease her nerves. But even as I said it, a small knot of unease formed in my stomach. We continued hiking, but the carefree vibe from earlier had vanished. I found myself jumping at every snap of a twig or rustling leaf. Sarah stayed close, her earlier excitement replaced with cautious glances over her shoulder. As we headed back to our campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every time I glanced behind us, I saw nothing but the same trees and shadows. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each step. We reached our clearing just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. But even the beautiful sunset couldn't dispel the unease that had settled over us. "Maybe we should pack up and head back," Sarah suggested as we prepared dinner. "I've got a bad feeling about this place." I was tempted to agree, but my pride got in the way. "Let's stick it out one more night," I said. "It's probably just our imaginations running wild. We came out here for an adventure, right?" Sarah nodded, but I could see she wasn't convinced. Neither was I, if I'm being honest. As darkness fell, we huddled close to our campfire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. We spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid of being overheard. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had us on edge. It was just after midnight when we heard it. A long, low whistle, followed by an answering call from the other side of our clearing. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "Alex," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's someone out there." Before I could respond, a figure stepped into the edge of our firelight. A man, tall and lean, with a scraggly beard and clothes that had seen better days. He was holding a hunting rifle. Well, he said, his voice rough. "Looks like we've got company, boys." As if on cue, more men emerged from the darkness. I counted 5 in total, all armed, all looking at us with a mixture of curiosity and something darker, more predatory. I stood up slowly, pulling Sarah with me. "We don't want any trouble," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're just camping. We'll pack up and leave right now if you want." The first man, clearly the leader, laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "Oh, you're not going anywhere," he said. "See, we've got ourselves a little operation out here, and we can't have you two running off and telling anyone about it." My mind raced. What kind of operation could they be running out here in the middle of nowhere? Then it clicked: drugs. We must have stumbled too close to their setup. "We haven't seen anything," Sarah said, her voice high with fear. "We don't even know where we are exactly. Please just let us go." The leader pretended to consider this for a moment, then shook his head. "Can't take that risk, sweetheart. No, I'm afraid you'll be staying with us for a while." The other men started to move closer, forming a tight circle around us. I looked around desperately for a way out, but we were completely surrounded. That's when I saw it. A flash of metal in the firelight. One of the men had pulled out a length of rope. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I grabbed a burning log from the fire and hurled it at the nearest man. He yelled in pain and surprise as embers scattered across his chest. "Run!" I shouted at Sarah, pushing her towards the darkest part of the forest. We took off, crashing through the underbrush. Behind us, I could hear shouts of anger and the sound of pursuit. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. We ran blindly through the dark forest, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us with every step. I had no idea where we were going, only that we needed to put as much distance between us and those men as possible. Sarah stumbled, and I caught her before she could fall. "Keep going," I gasped, pulling her along. "We can't stop." The sound of our pursuers seemed to be getting closer. They knew these woods better than we did, and they were gaining on us. Just when I thought we couldn't run any further, we burst out of the tree line and found ourselves at the edge of a steep ravine. The stream we had camped near had carved a deep gully into the earth, the water now a rushing torrent far below us. "What do we do?" Sarah cried, her eyes wild with fear. I looked back at the forest, saw flashlight beams dancing between the trees. They were almost upon us. "We have to jump," I said, gesturing to the other side of the ravine. It wasn't too wide, maybe 10 feet across. We could make it. We had to make it. Sarah looked at me like I was crazy, but the sound of voices growing nearer made up her mind. She nodded. "On 3, I said, gripping her hand tightly. 123. We leaped together, the ground disappearing beneath our feet. For a heart-stopping moment, we were suspended in the air, the roar of the water below us drowning out everything else. Then we hit the other side, rolling to break our fall. Pain shot through my ankle, but adrenaline kept me moving. I pulled Sarah to her feet, and we staggered into the cover of the trees on this side of the ravine. Behind us, I heard shouts of frustration. They had reached the ravine, but it had bought us precious time. We kept moving, pushing our exhausted bodies to their limits. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and desperate flight. Every sound had us freezing in terror, certain we were about to be discovered. As the first light of dawn began to pierce through the trees, we finally heard what we had been praying for, the distant hum of traffic. We had reached a road. Stumbling out of the forest, we flagged down the first vehicle we saw, an old pickup truck driven by an elderly farmer. The shock on his face when he saw us, dirty, bloodied, wild-eyed with fear, must have been unforgettable. We rushed to tell him our story as he drove us to the nearest police station. The authorities took our statements and sent out search teams, but they never found any trace of the men or their operation. Maybe they had already packed up, knowing we'd be bringing the law down on them. Took a long time for the nightmares to stop, for us to feel safe again. Sarah and I are still together, stronger for having survived that night, but we haven't gone camping since. Some scars cut too deep. Some fears are too primal to ever truly escape. Even now, when I lie awake at night, I can still hear those whistles echoing through the trees. I can still feel the terror of being hunted, and I can't help but wonder about those dark forests. What other secrets they might be hiding, just waiting for unsuspecting campers to stumble upon them, thinking they've found a peaceful getaway. My name is Alina, and I'm from Malaysia. I spent a summer in the United States as part of a summer school program at Virginia Tech University, where I had the opportunity to participate in various extracurricular activities. After all, what else were we going to do with our spare time? This gave me the chance to bond with many of my classmates as we took part in all sorts of exciting activities. One of the most incredible experiences I had was hiking in the Appalachian Mountains. I captured some of the most breathtaking views I have ever seen, and walking those hills will always remain one of the highlights of my life. But there's another reason I'll never forget my time in the Appalachians. It was also the setting for one of the most terrifying moments I've ever had. A moment so intense it left me trembling from the adrenaline. At one point during our hike, we took a break to eat snacks and sip water from our bottles, which hadn't stayed cold for long. I was chatting with my best friends on the trip, Sol and Gabby, when we suddenly heard rustling in the bushes nearby. The next thing I heard was our guide whispering, "Don't move. No one move a muscle." Until that point, our guide had been confident, even cocky on the trail, definitely the outdoorsy, manly type. But hearing fear in their voice made my blood run cold, which was no easy feat on such a hot day. I obeyed, staying as still as I could. I barely shifted my eyes toward the sound, and when I saw what emerged from the bushes, I couldn't even scream. I was frozen with fear, like a stone statue, though trembling uncontrollably. It was a black bear, and it was walking right toward me. I later learned that black bears don't have the best eyesight but an incredible sense of smell. Although we weren't cooking, it must have caught the scent of our snacks. I stayed as still as I could, but when the bear stood on its hind legs, my heart nearly stopped. I had no idea they could do that. I knew black bears were smaller and less aggressive than grizzlies or polar bears, but this thing wasn't small at all when it stood up. It was towering over me, and I was shaking, barely holding back the whimpers of fear. As it sniffed me, I knew that if I made even the slightest wrong move, if I didn't remain perfectly still, it could maul me right then and there. It was the most terrifying moment of my life. After a few moments, the bear seemed to lose interest in me and moved on to my friend Sol, who dropped his sandwich in a hurry. The bear sniffed at the sandwich but ignored it, then sniffed around her face and neck while standing on its hind legs. Out of nowhere, the bear lost interest and wandered off into the woods. We all let out a deep sigh of relief as it left, grateful it wasn't hungry or bold enough to attack us. Never before have I had such an up-close encounter with a powerful, wild animal. It left a lasting impression on me and made me develop an even deeper respect for nature. I'm just thankful it wasn't a grizzly or something from the Pacific Northwest, because if it had been, I probably wouldn't be here to tell this story. I grew up on a farm just outside of Limerick, Ireland, which, as you can imagine, made for quite an eventful childhood. It also meant my backyard was absolutely huge, giving me plenty of space to run around and play make-believe with my two sisters. Without a doubt, our favorite thing to play with was the Wendy house Dad built for us at the end of the garden. I'm not sure if they have these things everywhere, but a Wendy house is essentially a small playhouse for kids. And when I say small, I mean Dad built us a massive one, complete with a little hallway, a kitchen, and even a ladder leading up to a loft. It was so cute, and my sisters and I absolutely adored it. One summer night, when it was warm enough, we decided to ask Mom and Dad if we could sleep out in the Wendy house. They were understandably hesitant at first, but we pestered them until they finally agreed. We could have a sleepover in the Wendy house, but we had to be on our best behavior, not fight, and absolutely not wander around in the dark. It was a deal. You can understand why they were hesitant. The end of the garden, where the Wendy house stood, was about 100 meters from the house itself and backed onto some dense woodland. Definitely not the ideal spot to leave your kids overnight. But that's how 3 girls under 10 ended up spending the night in a dimly lit wooden playhouse in the middle of nowhere. For some reason, my older sister Kathleen thought it would be a good idea to tell us ghost stories. Kathleen's always been a bit of an odd one. She's had this fascination with ghosts, ghouls, and witches ever since she was young. She'd recently gotten her hands on a book of Irish ghost stories and thought it would be fun to share one with us. She told us about a ghost that originated in Ireland, not like Dracula or Frankenstein, but something uniquely Irish, the banshee. We were absolutely floored. We'd always heard about ghosts haunting graveyards, old houses, and creepy places you'd have to visit to see them. But here was Kathleen telling us about a ghost that would actually come to you to tell you someone in your family was going to die. And the way it would let you know was by screeching in the middle of the night, an ear-piercing wail that could chill you to the bone. Kathleen went on to explain that banshees were women who had died in painful, horrific ways, which is why they screamed. She said they looked like old, shriveled women with red eyes, and they carried bowls filled with blood. By the time Kathleen finished describing the nightmarish image of the banshee by torchlight, we were shaking in our pajamas. But somehow, when Dad came out to tell us it was bedtime, we managed to calm ourselves down and drift off to sleep, albeit uneasily. The next thing I knew, I woke up in complete darkness, and everything was unnervingly quiet. Then I heard something so terrifying that at first, I just froze in fear. It was a high-pitched, ear-piercing shriek, raspy and like it came from the throat of an old woman. When I finally found the courage to move, I shot up from my makeshift bed, shaking my sisters awake and telling them to listen. We all sat there in the dark, terrified, until we heard the shriek again. Hearing it for a second time had me just about out of my mind with fear, but my little sister took it even worse. It's a banshee. I remember her crying. We have to tell Mom and Dad. Then my big sister, bless her, decided that even though she's terrified, she's going to run to Mom and Dad so they can rescue us from the banshee. Say what you like about Kathleen, but she believed her own hype. She thought there was a banshee out there just as much as us. I mean, what else could have been making those ungodly noises out there? We are frantically looking for our torches, but in our panic, we can't find them. And when the banshee screams for a third time, Kathleen decides she can't afford to wait any longer. She gets up and in complete darkness climbs down the little ladder, opens the Wendy house door, and runs off to fetch us rescue. While Kathleen was gone, me and my little sister managed to find one of the torches. So we flick it on and point it down at the Wendy house door from the loft. I don't know what logic of that was, but that's what we did, and we cuddled together, cried, and waited for the banshee to get us. After a minute or so, we hear rustling outside the Wendy house. Something was moving outside. We are so scared of the thing hearing us that we've got our hands over our mouths. But we still can't stop crying, and we still don't turn the torch off. Suddenly, the door opens, and what stepped inside made me and my little sister scream in pure horror. Blood was pouring down the mouth and chin of my big sister, and now she's back in the light. Now she too can see that she's bleeding. She smears a bit of blood on her fingers, looks at it, then promptly collapses. We are absolutely inconsolable at this point. Me and my little sister are begging, screaming, crying for our parents to come and save us. To us, Kathleen just ran out to get help, and the banshee had got her before she could make it. We are trapped. The banshee's getting closer. We are doomed. Then there's more footsteps outside the Wendy house. Heavier footsteps now. Banshee footsteps. The door swings open again. Only this time, the face that appears is our dad wanting to know, what is going on in here? We're screaming. Dad, there's a banshee. Be careful. It got Kathleen. Behind you, Dad. He's obviously skeptical at first, but when he sees Kathleen's face, it's his turn to be terrified. He turns ashen, grabs Kathleen's little body up in his arms, and then rushes back to the house with her. So keep in mind that even at the point of parental intervention, Dad has not taken the time to tell us that there definitely isn't a banshee. And if anything, his reaction at Kathleen's face confirmed that not only is there definitely a banshee outside, but he's completely abandoned us. Seriously, just try and imagine being 7 years old and that being your truth. We didn't calm down for hours. Mom and Dad say we were still up crying at 1 o'clock in the morning, with the whole incident going on at about 10. Even when we knew everything was okay, we just cried because it had been so traumatic. Obviously, there was no banshee, and we didn't find this out until years later for obvious reasons. But what we had heard was the sound of two foxes mating. As me and my sisters now know all too well, when they do that, the lady fox screeches at the top of her lungs, producing what is a rather unsettling and otherworldly sound. Kathleen, being the brave big sister she was, had run out to protect us. But maybe if she was as nimble as she was courageous, she wouldn't have run directly into that tree in her blind panic, almost knocking herself out in the process. The best she could do then was retrace her poor, befuddled steps back to the Wendy house and pass out at the sight of her own blood. It's a story we tell every Christmas now, especially when there's a new boyfriend or husband making an appearance, and it always gets a giggle from those that hear it. But I think if you put a weapon to my head and ask me for the scariest moment of my life, I would say the Banshee when I was 7 years old. I am deadly serious, scarier than childbirth, scarier than finding the lump in my breast, scarier than confronting my first husband about his drinking, because I believed something I didn't understand was coming to get me. Something mythical, something supernatural, something that even Dad was scared of. Needless to say, there were no more sleepovers in the Wendy house that summer, and the whole thing collapsed a few years later. But me and my sisters will always have that story to make us laugh, even though at the time we were scared for our lives. Hi, everyone. This happened to me last year. I worked at a gas station, which I know is a pretty typical setting for strange incidents like this. But when you're actually working there, you don't really expect anything out of the ordinary to happen. It was a rainy night, not pouring, but enough to make it uncomfortable to be outside without shelter. On nights like this, fewer people come in to grab snacks or pay for gas with cash. So my job was pretty simple, just to be there. To stay awake, I would occasionally walk around the store to stretch my legs, but mostly, I just spent my time scrolling through social media. Then, suddenly, I heard a strange noise coming from outside. It sounded like someone tapping on the glass door. I looked up from my phone and saw a man standing outside in the rain, his face hidden under the hood of his jacket. I waved, letting him know the door wasn't locked and he could come in. But he didn't move, he just kept tapping on the door as if he didn't see me. I walked over, opened the door, and greeted him. He didn't acknowledge me but just walked past and went straight to the counter. It felt almost comical how oblivious he seemed. I went back behind the counter, and the man asked for a pack of cigarettes, paying with cash. He left, and that's when I looked out the window and realized the parking lot was empty. No cars at all, not even by the gas pumps. The man walked away, heading down the road, continuing along the shoulder in the rain like it was no big deal. If his car had broken down, I would have expected him to buy a gas container or something, but he just got cigarettes and left. I spent the next hour thinking about it. It was just such an odd interaction. No real reason for it to make sense, but I couldn't help but dwell on it. I kept walking around the store until I looked out the window again and saw the same man standing there. I went over to the door and opened it. "Are you all right?" I asked. He didn't respond. "You can borrow the phone if you need," I offered. "Down the road," he replied. I peeked out, but couldn't see anything in the distance. But then my eyes landed on a gas container by one of the pumps. He pointed at it and said, "Help!" That's when I realized he probably didn't speak much English. I agreed and walked out with him. He handed me a credit card, and I started pumping gas into the container. The man stood behind me, almost trying to stay out of sight, which made me uneasy. Once the container was full, I handed it to him and started walking back inside, but then he grabbed my arm. He started speaking quickly, but I couldn't understand him. I pulled away and kept walking to the door, but then he shouted something that sounded like he was calling to someone else. Just as I reached the door, I saw a man standing on the other side of the counter, shoving things into a backpack. He looked up at me, and in an instant he jumped over the counter. That's when everything went black. I woke up on the floor with a huge headache. It was only a few minutes after the incident, and I quickly realized the guy behind me must have hit me over the head, likely to help his friend escape. I called the cops, and they took me to the hospital. Fortunately, my injuries weren't serious. A concussion and a few stitches, but nothing major. The worst part was the shame I felt afterward, like I had been so easily tricked and had let them get away with it. But honestly, I'm grateful that I blacked out before things escalated. The CCTV footage later showed the guy inside holding a gun. If I had tried to stop him or even appeared like a threat, I could have been killed right there. The apartment building had stood for decades, its once grand facade now dulled by time and neglect. I wasn't looking for much when I found it, just something cheap, something quiet, somewhere to start over. The landlord barely asked any questions before handing me the key to 4B, muttering something about keeping to myself. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt heavy.
Stale.
The apartment was furnished, but everything was coated in a thin layer of dust, like no one had been there for years. The windows barely let in any light, and the overhead fixture flickered when I flipped the switch. Still, it was mine for now. I spent the first night unpacking, trying to make the place feel less like someone else's abandoned home. But even as I set my things down, I had the strangest sensation. I wasn't alone. It started with the sounds. A shuffling just outside my door at odd hours of the night. I checked through the peephole, but the hall was always empty. Then came the knocking. Soft, rhythmic taps at my door. 3:12 a.m. every single night. At first, I thought it was a prank. Some other tenant messing with the new guy. But when I asked the landlord about it, his face went pale. He told me there hadn't been another tenant in 4B for years, that no one should be knocking at my door. I started sleeping with the lights on. A week in, I noticed something else. The closet door. No matter how many times I closed it, I would wake up to find it slightly ajar. Just an inch. Just enough to make my skin crawl. Then one night I heard it. Breathing. Not my own. Not outside my door. But inside the apartment. Inside the closet. I froze in bed, my pulse hammering in my ears. The breathing was shallow, ragged, slow. I reached for my phone, fumbling in the dark, trying to turn on the flashlight. But before I could, the door creaked open another inch. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, bolted from the apartment, and pounded on the landlord's door. He answered in his robe, rubbing his eyes, looking annoyed, until he saw my face. "You saw him, didn't you?" he muttered. I could barely get the words out. "There's someone in my apartment," he sighed, stepping back to let me in. "Sit down." That's when he told me about the last tenant of 4B, a man who lived there decades ago who was found dead inside the closet. No sign of forced entry, no sign of struggle, just gone. "Some people say he never left," the landlord whispered, "that he's still there, waiting." I moved out that night, left half my stuff behind, didn't care. But now, in my new place, miles away from that cursed building, I wake up some nights to the sound of knocking. Soft, rhythmic, 3:12 a.m. And in the darkness, my closet door stands slightly ajar. I tried to tell myself it was paranoia, that the stress of the move and the things the landlord told me had burrowed into my mind, making me imagine things. But the knocking didn't stop. One night, I decided to be brave. I sat up in bed, gripping my phone with shaking hands, watching the door. When the knocking came, 3:12 a.m., on the dot, I forced myself to stand and approach. The hallway beyond my door was empty. I waited, holding my breath, expecting to hear footsteps, a shadow shifting down the corridor. Nothing, just silence and the distant hum of the streetlights outside. I closed the door and turned to face my room, and that's when I heard it. The whisper, not outside, inside. I spun around, the sound sending a bolt of ice down my spine. It wasn't words, just a breath. A slow, rattling inhale, like someone was standing inches behind me. I ran, again. But this time, I didn't stop outside my apartment. I grabbed my car keys, jumped into my car, and drove without looking back. I didn't even have a destination, just a way. Hours passed before I finally pulled into a motel parking lot, my hands still shaking. The room was sparse, but it didn't matter. It was safe, or so I thought. That night, as I lay curled up on the motel bed, exhausted but too afraid to close my eyes, my phone buzzed. A notification, a missed call. No number, just unknown. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a telemarketer, maybe just a glitch. But then, another notification, a voicemail. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the play button. Slowly, I pressed it, lifting the phone to my ear. Silence at first, then breathing, shallow, ragged, and then finally a whisper. You left the door open. My stomach turned to ice. I threw the phone onto the bed, my breathing ragged, my heart hammering in my chest. And then the knocking started. 3:12 a.m., soft, rhythmic, at the motel room door. This happened when I was around 10 or 11 years old, back in the early 1990s. Every summer, my mom would send my younger brother and me to stay with our cousins in Mexico. It was always a fun time. We'd spend hours playing, going to the beach, enjoying tasty food, and renting movies. Usually, we all slept in the same room, but on this particular night, my cousins and I got into an argument, and they kicked me out of the room. I wasn't too happy with them either, so I didn't mind and decided to sleep in the living room while everyone else stayed in their rooms. I went to bed around 10:30 or 11 p.m. I quickly fell asleep. At some point during the night, I'm not sure exactly when, maybe around 2 or 3 a.m., I heard someone knocking on the back door that led to a room used for storage. That part of the house was under construction, and a crew came every day to work on it. They were supposed to build a wall to close off the room, but for now it was still open so anyone could access it. I heard knocking, followed by a man's voice pleading in Spanish, "Miss, please open, please." I was in the living room, which was at the front of the house, while the knocks came from a room at the end of the hall. On either side of the hall were the rooms where my aunt, uncles, and cousins slept. I felt concerned for the man and wondered if he needed help. But I was also confused that no one else seemed to hear what I was hearing. Eventually, I worked up the courage to get up and investigate. I walked down the hall and tried to open the door. I twisted the handle several times, but the door wouldn't open. Meanwhile, the man kept pleading for someone to open it. I even tried to talk to him, asking, "Hello, sir? Do you need help?" But he didn't respond. He just kept asking for the door to be opened. As I was unable to open the door and also becoming a little frightened, I decided to run back to the sofa bed and get under the covers. Not long after that, I passed out. The next morning, everyone was up. Auntie was cooking breakfast and my cousins were no longer mad at me. I was ready to tell them about my experience the night before while we all gathered to sit at the table, but decided to wait and see if anyone else would mention anything about it. And big surprise, no one did. It seems I was the only one who heard that man and the knocks. Summer came to an end and I was getting ready to say goodbye to my cousins. I was getting ready to have one more ball game with my cousins. The construction crew had also finished the construction of the house and they were sitting, chit-chatting, and drinking beers. My cousin kicked the ball a little too hard and it went long. One of the construction men saw the ball coming and picked it up and made his way to me as I ran towards him. He said, "Here's your ball." I said thank you as I grabbed the ball from him. And then he asked, "Why didn't you open the door for me, little girl?" I bolted back to my cousins. My mother picked me and my brother up shortly after that. I continued to go back there a couple more times for the summer, but thankfully I never saw that man again. This happened just last winter in early February. I was on my way to deliver my next DoorDash order. I was feeling pretty tired since I'd been driving for about 4 hours, and it was almost midnight. After this delivery, I was definitely going to call it a night and head home, worried about getting drowsy on the road, especially with all the ice and snow. I was driving down a fairly quiet road, one that connects two of the main towns in the city. There's a 5-mile stretch in the middle that has absolutely nothing. No houses, no buildings, just empty space. As I was driving through the stretch, I'm not sure what happened, but I suddenly got hit with this wave of tiredness that made me lose focus on the road for just a few seconds. But that was all it took. I hit a patch of ice and slid toward the side. Even though I snapped awake in an instant, it was too late. I tried steering back onto the road, but my car just slid off into the small ditch between the road and the woods. It wasn't a serious crash, though. Thankfully, the snow softened the impact, but it still left me a bit shaken, and I knew right away that I wasn't getting out of this on my own. My car was stuck on the incline of the ditch, buried in thick snow. I didn't bother getting out to check how bad it was, though I did try maneuvering the car to gain some traction. All that did was make things worse. In the middle of figuring out what to do, I noticed a set of headlights further down the road. At first, I thought it was just a passing car, but after a few seconds, I realized it wasn't moving. Someone must have been parked down the road with their headlights on. I found it unnerving, given how long and empty this stretch of road was. They weren't close enough to have stopped and offered help, but they weren't far enough away either to have missed seeing my headlights. I pulled out my phone and called my dad, knowing he'd still be awake and might be able to help. This was the first time I'd found myself in a situation like this, so I wasn't sure what to do. He said he'd call roadside assistance and then drive down to wait with me. I thanked him, feeling a little relief knowing he'd be here soon. I looked back at the road, hoping to spot the headlights from the car I'd seen earlier, but they were gone. It was too dark to see anything at that distance without lights, so I couldn't tell if they'd driven off or just turned off their headlights. The more I thought about it, the more it creeped me out. I kept my eyes fixed down the road, barely looking away for a few seconds, as my paranoia started to creep in. It was something about the silence as well that made it more uneasy, only hearing the wind outside my car and nothing else. Then, after 3 minutes of waiting, I saw a figure walking toward my car. He was down the road, coming from the direction where the headlights had been. I watched him as he slowly made his way through the snow, getting to just about 15 feet from the front of my car. Then he stopped. He stood there in the snow, facing me, but not moving. I couldn't see much of him as he had a hoodie covering his face. But the way he just stood there, my headlights started to terrify me. After a moment, I honked my horn softly a few times just to let them know that I was in the car and that I could see them. They still didn't move or acknowledge me. But just as I was pulling out my phone to call my dad again, the man turned around and walked away, disappearing down the road. I still called my dad to let him know about this really strange person that was out here, and he said he was just a minute away. I stayed on the phone with him this time, and only 30 seconds later, I saw headlights turn on down the road and begin moving toward my car. Once they were right across the road, they parked and turned off their lights. I couldn't see over the ditch, but I heard a door open as I yelled through the phone what was going on. But then my dad's car pulled right in front of my view and screeched to a stop. I heard him yell at someone as they got back in their car and sped away. They didn't come back, but my dad said the guy was holding something in his hands that looked like he was going to break into my car with. Everything went okay after that, though, and the car ended up not even having much damage to it. I'm not sure what was about to happen that night, but I know I'm really lucky to have not found out. When my mom was 16, a year before she got pregnant with me, she had the same dream every night for about a year. In this recurring dream, she and a boy around her age were surrounded by a group of men in a cemetery. My mom didn't recognize the boy, but every night, one of the men would step forward and ask, "Would you die for him?" My mom would say no, since she didn't know who he was. The man would then turn to the boy and ask, "Would you die for her?" The boy would respond no as well. But one night, something changed. The man asked the boy first, "Will you die for her?" He answered no, just as he always had. But then, the man turned to my mom and asked, "Will you die for him?" My mom, unsure why, maybe out of curiosity or fear of what might happen, replied, "Yes." The man stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Your fate is sealed, and so is his." But this time, nothing happened. He didn't harm them. She just woke up. That day, my mom was scheduled to model in a fashion show in a nearby city. Her aunt had come to drive her and accompany her, along with my mom's best friend. Everything seemed normal that morning. My mom got dressed, her friend arrived, and her aunt picked them up. They piled into the car for the 3 to 4 hour drive. But about 10 minutes out, my mom realized she'd forgotten something at home. They had plenty of time, so they decided to turn around and go back. As they headed home, singing along to the music, my mom's friend suddenly asked if they could turn the music down. "Do you hear that?" she asked. My mom and her aunt fell silent, listening closely. Then, they heard a strange scraping sound, like metal against concrete. They looked around, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but there was nothing in sight, no other cars on the road. When they returned to the house, my mom hurried inside while her friend and aunt checked the car to make sure the strange scraping noise wasn't coming from it. Everything seemed fine, and even my grandfather gave it a once-over and confirmed everything was in order. The whole thing took about 20 to 30 minutes. They brushed it off and headed back toward the highway. As they finally got on the road, they saw police cars blocking off a lane, surrounding a horrific accident. My mom's aunt slowed down, and a cop waved her down, telling her to stop. "Give us a second to clear this lane of debris." "What happened?" her aunt asked, clearly shaken. "It was a head-on collision," the officer replied. "When did this happen?" "We were just here 30 minutes ago." The officer looked at them in surprise. "It happened about 30 minutes ago. You didn't see anything?" They explained they'd heard a strange noise that sounded like metal scraping against concrete. After exchanging uneasy glances, her aunt asked, "Is everyone okay?" "No, ma'am. You ladies are lucky. If you'd been even 3 seconds later, that could have been you." With that, the officer waved them through and wished them a nice day. But as they drove past the wreckage, my mom looked out the window and saw them removing a body from one of the cars. Her heart sank as she realized it was the boy from her dream. After that day, she never had the dream again. This is a story that my mom shared from her childhood, which I've put into my own words without changing any of the details. Memories can be strange. Every time you think back on one, it gets distorted just a little, and over the years, they evolve into something unrecognizable from what actually happened. It's like that game we played in school, telephone, where you whisper a message to someone and they pass it on to the next person, and by the time it gets back to you, the original message is barely recognizable. I often wonder how much my childhood differs from how I remember it. How many details have I altered? How many things do I recall that may not have actually happened? I accept that not everything is exactly how I think it was, and I'm okay with that. But there's one memory that haunts me, and it's one I can recall in vivid detail. It's funny how the memories you'd rather forget tend to be the ones that stay with you most clearly. The memory I'm talking about happened just outside of Dallas, Texas, and I can still remember exactly what I was wearing. I had on a yellow dress with white polka dots, long sleeves, and it went all the way past my ankles, as my parents required because of their religious beliefs. I hated that dress. At 11, my parents didn't think I was old enough to pick my own clothes, so I had to wear it. It was hard to move in and kind of tight from mid-thigh down, especially because my mom made it herself. My older sister, who had just gotten her driver's license, wanted to take the car out, and my mom said she could, as long as she took me along. So off we went. We left around 6 p.m., and it was already getting dark. My sister, still uncomfortable behind the wheel, wanted to drive at night to avoid the heavier traffic. We stuck to side streets and back roads until we ended up on a long, quiet stretch of highway. We'd been driving for about an hour, just listening to the radio and enjoying our taste of freedom. We were driving back and forth along about 10 miles of the USHW 80 between Mesquite and Forney, Texas, just outside of Dallas. It's busier there now, but back then, it was just a stretch of trees and railroad tracks. That's when we heard the engine clunk, and my sister's lack of experience behind the wheel became apparent as the car sputtered a few hundred yards before it finally died and came to a stop. We'd run out of gas, and the nearest station was a few miles back. This was before cell phones, so we had no choice but to grab the gas can from the trunk and walk back to the station. That's where the polka dot dress comes into play. After about 100 yards, I realized that it was going to be way too difficult to keep up with my sister for several miles in that dress. So she handed me the keys and told me to wait in the car. I locked all the doors once I got back in and stared out the rear window, watching until my sister was out of sight. I was a shy, easily frightened little girl at the time, and it didn't take long for the darkness to start getting to me. There were no street lights, and I hadn't seen a single car since my sister had left. The only light was from the full moon, which was bright enough to reveal the thick tree line about 30 yards off the road. The silence around me felt suffocating, and after what seemed like an eternity, my nerves began to fray. Not even the crickets were chirping. It was unnervingly quiet, and the longer I sat there, the more aware I became of just how still the world around me was. I wanted it to end, but at the same time, I feared what might bring it to a close. I just sat there, frozen, almost expecting to hear the boogeyman's whispers in the wind at any moment. All I could think to do was try to fall asleep, hoping that by the time I woke up, my sister would be back. I leaned the seat back, closed my eyes, and tried to block out the fear. 15 minutes passed, and I turned this way and that, trying to find a somewhat comfortable position. It was while I was fidgeting that an eerie sensation ran down my spine. I suddenly felt that I wasn't alone, that unshakable dread of being watched. I was lying on my side, facing the steering wheel, looking down at the floorboard, my back to the passenger window. I kept my eyes tightly shut, too scared to open them. I was afraid of what I couldn't see, of what might be lurking just outside my window. I took a deep breath, counted to 3, and opened my eyes. There was nothing there. I took another deep breath and quickly glanced to the driver's side window. Still nothing. I exhaled, telling myself, "You're okay. You're okay." I sat there wide-eyed, focusing on the steering wheel for another 10 minutes or so, trying to steady my nerves. Then, all at once, a paralyzing terror struck me. A voice in my head kept repeating, asterisk, "Don't turn around." Asterisk, my heart began to race, and my body stiffened as panic took hold. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I was just overreacting, that there was nothing outside the window. But, to my horror, a shadow shifted on the driver's seat and filled it back up again. Then, 3 loud taps on the glass behind me shattered the silence. That shadow had been there even before I opened my eyes, and the thought that whoever or whatever was outside had been standing there watching me was terrifying. My heart pounded as the taps came again, this time louder. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Summoning all the courage I had, I turned toward the window. "Hello," I whispered nervously, my voice trembling but trying to sound firm. What I saw sent chills down my spine. The air felt suddenly cold, and the night seemed to take on a sinister edge. The man outside was unnaturally tall, with the top of his head well above the window. His hands were massive, his fingers long and unnervingly thin. As my eyes tried to focus, he bent down, towering over the car, his face just inches from the window, his eyes locking onto mine. He was clean-shaven, but his cheeks and eye sockets were deeply sunken, and his eyes bulged outward, unnaturally large for his face. Though it could have been the darkness, I swear his eyes were completely black. He leaned in closer, and in a gravelly voice he said, "Little girl," as if savoring the words. Asterisk, "I asked where your parents are." Asterisk, "I'm with my sister." I stammered, "We are." He cut me off and suddenly pulled out a flashlight, shining it into the car. "I can't understand you," he said. Asterisk, "I'm gonna have to ask you to roll down the window. It's all right. I'm a cop." Asterisk. The light from the flashlight revealed that he was indeed wearing a police uniform, and for a brief moment, I felt relief. I rolled down the window slowly and spoke louder, trying to steady my voice. "I'm with my sister. We broke down and she went to get some gas. I couldn't go with her because I can't walk in this dress." A slight grin spread across his face. "I see," he said, his voice almost gleeful. Asterisk, "So you're not out here all alone then?" Asterisk, "No, sir," I replied, still trying to sound calm. "Just until my sister gets back." "And when will she be back?" he asked, his grin widening. "The closest station is a few miles away. That could take a while, I said, my nerves starting to unravel. I felt a tightness in my chest. I don't know. She's been gone a couple of hours now, I guess. He looked thoughtful for a moment before speaking again. Asterisk, tell you what. Why don't you come with me, and we can go get your sister? You won't have to walk. Asterisk. I froze. It hadn't hit me until that moment, but I realized that I hadn't seen any headlights in either direction for the past 20 minutes. I turned to look out the rear window, and a wave of dread washed over me as I confirmed that there was no car in sight, no lights anywhere. But where's your cop car? I asked, my voice hesitant. He pointed off toward the tree line in the distance. Asterisk, right over there, just through the trees. Haven't you ever wanted to ride in a cop car? Asterisk. A new wave of fear gripped me. I turned my gaze back to him, my heart pounding. Asterisk. I think I should just wait here for my sister to get back. She won't be much longer. Asterisk. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a tone I didn't like. Asterisk, look, it's past curfew, and if you don't get home soon, I'll have to arrest you. Okay. Your parents won't like it if you get arrested now. Will they? Asterisk. That new fear, being arrested, started creeping into my mind. But my instincts screamed that I shouldn't get out of the car. I'm sorry, sir, I said, my voice shaking. I really should wait for my sister. I started to roll up the window. Just as the window was nearly closed, his fingers shot through the gap, trying to stop it. In a panic, I slammed the window up, trapping his fingers between the door and the glass. He screamed in pain, pulling his hand back. Asterisk, you fucking little bitch. You smashed my fucking fingers. Asterisk, he yelled, his face twisted with rage. I'm sorry, I said quickly, pulling back as far as I could into my seat, my body shaking. I didn't know what to do. He yanked violently on the door handle, shaking the car from side to side. Asterisk, open this fucking door, you little bitch. Asterisk, he screamed, his fury growing. Do you know how long you'll go to jail for resisting arrest? He snarled. He pulled something that looked like a nightstick from his belt and started banging on the roof of the car, then smacked the window again. A web of cracks spread across the glass where the club struck, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he got in. The fear of what he might do next overwhelmed me. I was terrified that he would follow through on his threats and make things worse. I sobbed, barely able to form words. Okay, I said, not even realizing what I was agreeing to. He gestured toward the vehicle, signaling me to follow him. Yes, sir, I replied, rolling up the window and stepping out of the car. His voice was cold as he said, Asterisk, this way. Asterisk tremors ran through my body as I hesitated, but I followed him, my legs trembling. Something was terribly wrong, and all I could think was that he was leading me toward something unspeakable behind those trees. I wanted to run, but my dress made it impossible. Even if I did run, I knew I wouldn't get far, and there was nowhere to go. We were about halfway to the tree line, only 40 feet away, when headlights suddenly lit up the field we were standing in. Come on, he snarled, grabbing my arm and pulling me forward faster. As we neared the trees, the sound of shouting filled the air. The headlights were now beaming directly on us, like spotlights from heaven. I heard multiple voices, all female, yelling in our direction. Asterisk, get away from that man, little girl. Asterisk, one of them shouted. Asterisk, that man's not a police officer. He's a bad man. Asterisk, another voice cried out. Asterisk, let her go, you demon. God is watching you. Asterisk. Then more voices shouted. Asterisk, little girl, come here to us. Get away from the bad man. Asterisk, the barrage of shouts finally caused the man to release me, and he ran into the trees. I was frozen for a moment, but the voices called again, urging me to run to them. Without thinking, I sprinted as fast as I could, tearing my dress in the process. I reached the open side doors of an old white church van, where two women, dressed in thigh-length dresses, stood. They pulled me inside, and another woman caught me in her arms as the door slammed behind me. Inside the van were 6 women, all older, larger women. One of them gently reassured me, Asterisk, "It's all right, sweetie. You're safe now. We won't let the bad man hurt you." Asterisk through my tears, I said that I had to wait for my sister, and they reassured me that they would wait and keep him away. They kept telling me not to look out the window, pulling me close to shield my eyes. But curiosity eventually got the better of me, and I peered sideways, trying to see out the window, despite the woman holding me. What I saw still haunts me to this day. The man was now completely naked, running on all fours, in and out of the tree line and through the field. He moved unnaturally fast, and I can't explain exactly what he was doing, but it was terrifying. Sometimes he came as close as a few feet from the van, making the most disturbing guttural growls and grunts. The women tried to distract me by singing nursery rhymes and hymns, and whenever he got too close, they would roll down the windows and shout at him to go away. He would disappear, only to reappear again like clockwork. Finally, my sister appeared in the distance, gas can in hand, on the road behind us. I told my sister everything that had happened, and she said that she'd felt an overwhelming sense of dread the entire time she was walking back. She'd been running the whole way. Something just felt wrong to her. When she got back to the car, the ladies immediately surrounded us, forming a protective circle around the car as she filled it with gas. The man was standing about 10 feet outside the tree line, fully dressed now, just watching us. He didn't say anything, just stood there while the women told him to leave us alone and not get any closer. When the car finally started, one of the women said they'd follow us to make sure we made it home safely. We drove about half a mile, then made a U-turn to head back. As we passed the spot where we had been stranded, the man was on all fours again, completely nude, sniffing at the pavement where our car had been. The old church van stayed behind us the entire way, and I couldn't take my eyes off of it. I was terrified that somehow the man would catch up to us if they weren't there. But when we turned onto our street, the van wasn't behind us anymore. It didn't turn onto the street with us, and I didn't see a single car pass on the cross street. Maybe they just turned around and left, I thought at the time. When we pulled up to the house, my mom was waiting on the front porch, and it was clear that she had been crying. She said she'd had a terrible feeling, like something bad had happened, and that we'd been gone too long. I told her everything, and she immediately called the police, who came to the house to take a statement. I thought that would be the last time I'd hear about the man, but a couple of months later, I saw a news story about a girl who had gone missing from a park near where our car had broken down. Witnesses said the last time they saw her, she was talking to a tall, lanky man in a police officer's uniform. Sometimes, when I think back on that night, I shiver at the thought of that bad man. But other times, I think about the women in the van, how they showed up just in time, and how they vanished without a trace. I've wondered then, and still wonder now, if maybe I was being protected. I'm not sure, and I know it all sounds a little crazy, but man, what a weird night. The moment I realized I wasn't alone in that park, every horror movie I'd ever watched flashed through my mind. The rhythmic sound of my feet hitting the pavement was suddenly joined by another set of footsteps, perfectly in sync with mine, yet always just out of sight. As the shadows grew longer and my heart raced faster, I knew this late-night run was about to turn into a nightmare I might not escape. It had started as a normal Tuesday. Work had been as stressful as usual, and by the time I got home, I was a bundle of nerves and pent-up energy. A run always helped clear my head. So, I laced up my shoes and headed to Oakwood Park, just a few blocks from my apartment. The park was different at night. The familiar playground and picnic areas seemed eerie in the dim glow of the scattered streetlights. But I'd run here countless times before, and the solitude was part of the appeal. Just me, the sound of my breathing, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. I started my usual route, a winding path that looped around the park's perimeter. The first lap was uneventful. I focused on my breathing, feeling the day's tension start to melt away with each step. By the second lap, I had fallen into a comfortable rhythm. That's when I first noticed it, a sound just on the edge of my hearing, almost imperceptible. At first, I thought it was just an echo of my own footsteps bouncing off the trees. But as I rounded a bend, I realized it was something else. Another set of footfalls perfectly matching my pace. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see another late-night runner, but the path behind me was empty. A chill ran down my spine, despite the warmth of the evening. I picked up my pace slightly, trying to convince myself I was being ridiculous. It was probably just an animal in the underbrush, or maybe my imagination playing tricks on me. But the sound persisted, always behind me, always in perfect sync with my own steps. I tried varying my speed, even stopping abruptly at one point. Each time, the phantom footsteps adjusted, maintaining that eerie synchronization. My heart was pounding now, and not just from the exertion. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The park that had always been my refuge now felt like a trap. The trees lining the path seemed to loom over me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I decided to cut my run short and head back to the entrance. As I turned onto the main path, I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a dark shape ducking behind a tree. "Hello!" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet park. "Is someone there?" No response, just the distant hum of traffic and the soft rustling of leaves. I started walking briskly toward the exit, fighting the urge to break into a sprint. Running would make me look like prey, I thought. Better to stay calm and alert. But the footsteps behind me quickened to match my new pace. They sounded closer now, no longer trying to hide their presence. I could hear the crunch of gravel, the soft thud of feet on grass. Couldn't help it. I ran. I sprinted down the path, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps behind me broke into a run as well, growing louder, closer. I chanced another look over my shoulder and saw a figure emerging from the shadows, tall, unnaturally thin, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost inhuman. I pushed harder, my legs burning with the effort. The park entrance was just ahead, the street lights of the main road a beacon of safety. Just a little further, something caught my foot and I went sprawling onto the path. Pain shot through my hands and knees as they scraped against the gravel. I scrambled to get up, certain that at any moment I would feel hands grabbing me, pulling me back into the darkness. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. No shadowy figure, no sound of footsteps, just the empty path stretching back into the dimly lit park. I didn't wait to see if my pursuer would reappear. I limped as fast as I could to the park entrance, not stopping until I was under the bright lights of the main street. Only then did I pause to catch my breath, my hands on my knees as I gulped in air. A couple walking their dog gave me a concerned look as they passed. I must have been quite a sight, sweaty, wide-eyed with bloody palms and torn running clothes. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, taking a step towards me. I nodded, not trusting my voice just yet. They lingered for a moment, clearly unsure whether to believe me before continuing on their way. As my breathing slowed and the adrenaline began to fade, I started to doubt myself. Had there really been someone following me, or had I let my imagination run wild, turning normal nighttime park sounds into something sinister? I looked back at the park entrance. Everything seemed peaceful now. No shadowy figures, no phantom footsteps, just a quiet, empty park at night. Shaking my head, I turned to walk home. I'd barely gone a block when I heard it again, footsteps matching my pace exactly, coming from just behind me. I whirled around ready to confront whoever or whatever had been stalking me, but the sidewalk was empty. The sound stopped the moment I did. A car drove by, its headlights sweeping across the street. For just a split second, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadow cast on the sidewalk beside me. A shadow that didn't match my own. I ran all the way home, not daring to look back again. I slammed my apartment door shut behind me, locking it with shaking hands. Only when I was safely inside did I allow myself to break down, sliding to the floor as sobs racked my body. What had happened in that park? Who or what had been following me? The rational part of my brain tried to come up with explanations, stress-induced hallucinations, an overactive imagination fueled by too many late-night horror movies, maybe even some prankster getting their kicks by scaring runners. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations fit. What I had experienced was something else, something that didn't belong in the world as I understood it. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains in the breeze made me jump. I kept expecting to hear those footsteps outside my door, to see that impossibly tall, thin figure looming in my bedroom doorway. Morning came, and with it, a semblance of normalcy. In the harsh light of day, my experience in the park seemed almost laughable. I went to work, trying to push the memories of the previous night to the back of my mind. But as evening approached, I felt that familiar dread creeping back in. The thought of going home, of being alone in my apartment as darkness fell, was unbearable. I stayed late at the office long after everyone else had gone home. When I finally left, I took a taxi instead of walking, even though my apartment was only a few blocks away. As we drove past Oakwood Park, I found myself staring out the window, scanning the shadows between the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a flash of movement, a figure standing unnaturally still among the bushes. The taxi driver must have noticed my unease. "Everything okay back there?" he asked, meeting my eyes in the rearview mirror. I tore my gaze away from the park. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Everything's fine." But I knew it wasn't, because as we drove away, I could have sworn I saw that figure step out onto the path. And even though we were moving, even though it was impossible, I heard it. Footsteps perfectly in sync with the motion of the car following me home. I haven't been back to Oakwood Park since that night. I've changed my running route, sticking to well-lit streets and populated areas. But sometimes when I'm walking home late or lying awake in the dark, I hear it, that soft, steady rhythm of footsteps, always just out of sight. And I wonder, are they getting closer? I was always a very naive and innocent person, the kind of optimist who believed there was goodness in everyone's heart, an outlook that, in hindsight, was dangerously naive. I now realize that wearing those rose-colored glasses put a big flashing red target on my back. When you think of scary stories involving creepy behavior or psychological abuse, you usually expect it to come from a stranger. In my case, it came from my mother-in-law. At first, my husband's mother adored me, but not for the reasons I initially thought. She saw me as someone who could be easily controlled. I was meek, passive, and it made sense to her that I would be the type of person she could manipulate. Looking back, I shudder at how unsettling the situation really was. For the sake of this story, I'll refer to my mother-in-law as Mrs. Psycho. In the beginning, things between her and I were great, or so I thought. She would take me shopping, give me compliments about my hair, and do all those typical girly things. As my relationship with my husband became more serious, Mrs. Psycho would rave to anyone who would listen about how much she adored me, calling me the daughter she never had. Naturally, I thought things were progressing positively. But as time went on, I started to notice some unsettling things about her. I began picking up on odd bits of behavior at parties and social gatherings. She would sulk in a corner, and I convinced myself it was just her being socially awkward or anxious. But now, looking back, I see it for what it was. She was constantly complaining about something negative going on in her life, how she'd fallen off her bike and hurt her elbow while riding through a construction zone, how one neighbor had complained about her parking in front of his house, how she lost her job because she couldn't get along with a coworker. The list went on. In every story, she painted herself as the victim of some strange, unfortunate event. One huge red flag that my naive mind didn't understand at the time was the story she repeatedly told about her other son, my husband's brother. She'd say disturbing things like how he had held her, my husband, and his father hostage in their own home, even physically assaulting his father. The way she told it made it sound like my husband's brother was a bully, terrorizing the whole family. In all her wild stories and accusations, she scolded her son in ways I just couldn't imagine scolding my own child. What my husband and I didn't fully understand at the time was that the real issue wasn't necessarily my husband's brother, but the woman who was the driving force behind the chaos and dysfunction. Psychological abuse can trigger emotional responses in unpredictable and disturbing ways. Mrs. Psycho's behavior became clearly unhealthy and creepy after our engagement. It was evident that she had an unhealthy enmeshment with her son and me, something I had no idea how to handle. First, she was angry that we didn't tell her immediately when we had gotten engaged. Then she was angry when we changed the wedding date without first asking for her permission. She expressed the desire for my future husband and I to live in the upstairs of her house and pay her rent. We told her that we can afford our own home and we want to start a family, so that wouldn't work out. The infuriation in her eyes was frightening. She would look normal one moment, then if you told her something she didn't want to hear, her eyes would turn black. The memory of her eyes still sends me with a frightening chill down my spine. From there, she became increasingly controlling. Mrs. Psycho and her husband, Mr. Psycho, would start showing up to our house every other day or so. I started counting how long they could go without having to see us, and that number came to 3 days. There was no privacy, and I felt that I had to close the curtains over our windows every night. I locked the bedroom door a few times before bed just to be on the safe side. Despite our relationship being pleasant in the beginning, I noticed that I was now feeling like I was treading on eggshells around Mrs. Psycho, or rather landmines. I realized I couldn't talk to her like I used to be able to when me and her son were just dating. I remembered when we would be able to have nice in-depth conversations, and I had allowed myself to be vulnerable with her. I confided in her about how I had a lot of social anxiety and that her son came into my life during a time that I was suffering from crippling depression. I talked about how he had brought a ray of sunshine into my life, thinking that speaking kindly about her son would please her. But she just had this unfeeling, glazed look across her face. Hoping to mend my relationship with her, I decided to help her out one day with organizing her antiques. She had this hobby of going to auctions and buying and selling knickknacks, buttons, and stuff like that. She would get very proud of her collections of things that I sort of thought were junk. But to be polite, I told her I saw beauty in these things, hoping to get back on her good side. There were some creepy dolls in the mix, including this horrifying-looking vampire doll with piercing red eyes. She said she had had that doll for years and used to scare my husband with it when he was a kid. She laughed at this, and the sound had an eerie, satanical vibe to it. As if this wasn't enough to freak me out, she then told me the story about how a female coworker complained about her to the HR department at her company. Mrs. Psycho wrote a letter that was meant for the coworker's husband, telling him that she was cheating on him. To remain as anonymous as possible, she told me how she slipped on a pair of black gloves and drove the letter to a faraway location so that her address couldn't be traced. I remember feeling very uneasy about her story, wondering how she could get angry enough to drive hours away just to cause emotional harm to another human being. There came a point after hearing this story when I didn't want to be left alone with my partner's mom anymore. He tried to talk to his parents about how I was feeling, like I was on eggshells around them, but they flipped the narrative to say that they were the ones feeling like they were on eggshells around me. During this time, I painstakingly realized that psychological torture exists in the form of extreme invalidation. Not having your feelings acknowledged can really drive a person crazy. It was then when I felt a little more clued into what may have happened to Mrs. Psycho's other son. I can't be sure because I never met the guy, but I think he was driven mad by his mother's severe emotional neglect. Now she was pulling the same tricks on me and my partner, gaslighting us into believing that we were just too sensitive. When my husband and I started figuring out that something was off, things got even creepier. His parents started showing up to our house to corner us into submission. What I mean is, they would tell us stories to make them seem like victims so that we would give in to demands of what they wanted at the time. If we denied their requests, they would use psychological manipulation by telling us that we were uncaring or ungrateful. One example of this manipulation was when I became pregnant. I explained that the smell of pizza made me extremely sick, but this was ignored. When Mrs. Psycho insisted that we go to a pizza restaurant for her birthday, I was confused with why I felt like I couldn't say no. My husband was in the same predicament. Somehow, I think we sensed that something bad would happen to us if we declined. This is also because Mrs. Psycho's husband and her sister had contacted us, telling us explicitly that they weren't allowed to say no to her dinner invitations anymore. They explained it like saying no hurts her feelings. But there was something else there that I can't quite explain. something hidden beneath the surface that sounded really threatening. I had no idea why, but I just did not feel safe. Then, only 2 weeks after giving birth to our daughter, I had the creepiest interaction of my life. Mrs. Psycho caught me alone while I was on my front porch. The weather was really nice, so I was rocking with my baby in one of our outdoor chairs. She came up to the doorstep and assumed a seat in the chair next to me. Then, in a quiet, ominous voice, she said to me, "You have to share her, you know." Her black eyes flicked to the infant in my arms. I know what you might be thinking, but this wasn't said in a cute, excited new grandma kind of way. Her voice sounded cold and possessive with certain passive-aggressive intent behind the statement. I naturally clutched my arms around my daughter tighter, feeling a protective instinct take over me. Mrs. Psycho had expressed to me before that she had always wanted to have a daughter, but was only ever able to have sons. Maybe I was being influenced by the postpartum hormones or just overall feeling paranoid, but a disturbing thought occurred to me that she might want to get rid of me somehow to have my daughter to herself. I later told my husband about the bizarre interaction with his mom and how I couldn't keep up with the heavy psychological demands of his parents anymore. It was all taking a strange emotional toll on me as well as a strain on our marriage, and I still couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Nevertheless, they were causing us a lot of stress, which was impacted on me all the more while I was trying to adapt to my role as a new mother. I felt like I was going crazy. They even restricted me in bizarre ways, telling me that I was not allowed to refer to our daughter as my baby. The stress was enough to make me physically sick. At first, my husband hesitated when I told him about my concerns, stating the usual spiel that was natural for him to say, that they were his parents and he couldn't just drop contact with them. But something in his voice contained fear, and it wouldn't take long before he would realize how screwed up the situation actually was. The incident that drove him to the point of cutting off his parents happened when they cornered us in our living room, demanding that we watch their aggressive dog while they went on vacation for 5 days. My husband almost caved but stayed firm when he told them, "No, we can't. We have a 2-month-old baby to look after." The murderous glare his mom then flashed at me was intense and enough to make me crawl out of my skin. I thought for sure she was about to lunge at me and wring her icy cold hands around my neck, causing me death by strangulation. I was terrified. Mr. and Mrs. Psycho eventually left our house, but they were clearly angry that they weren't able to convince us to conform to their will. My husband and I had a dark, suspicious feeling that something bad was about to happen. First, we received lengthy emails from Mrs. Psycho, mostly insulting me. She said she thought I was brainwashing her son, and she went on to portray herself as a victim. She used the knowledge of my anxiety disorder to make an argument that I was mentally unstable and dangerous. She threatened to post about me on Facebook and mess up our lives if we didn't apologize for deviating from what she wanted. At the same time, she told me that I was dead to her and listed all the mistakes I had made in the past as well as my faults. We remained silent, not wanting to engage with her any further. My husband and I were scared, spending most of our days cooped up in our bedroom, not knowing what to expect. But we stayed strong through the process of separating from the toxic relationship. Mrs. Psycho proceeded to make good on her threat, posting about me publicly on Facebook. She said that I was crazy. She even went a step further, saying that I had borderline personality disorder, which was entirely fabricated. It didn't end there, though. An active smear campaign against me began when Mr. and Mrs. Psycho actually went door to door in our community, posing as concerned citizens, warning everyone about their extremely dangerous, manipulative, 5-foot-tall daughter-in-law. But what they didn't expect was how the neighbors reacted. Instead of believing the stories they were spreading about me, most people in the neighborhood were more wary of Mrs. Psycho than they were of me. Rather than ruining my reputation as they had hoped, their efforts made everyone uncomfortable. People were genuinely creeped out by Mrs. Psycho's behavior, and equally unnerved by Mr. Psycho's passive willingness to go along with everything. It seemed that after years of enduring his wife's abuse, he had become an empty shell of a man, like a flying monkey to her, a term used for someone who blindly supports an abusive individual. There were a few doctors and therapists in our neighborhood who suspected that Mrs. Psycho might be projecting, meaning she was confessing her own dangerous and volatile tendencies while blaming me. Along with stories of her interactions with others in the neighborhood, it became clear that something was very wrong with her. This made the situation even more unsettling when we suspected that Mrs. and Mr. Psycho were coming to our house for a confrontation. My husband and I were in the living room, watching Survivor with our baby, when the doorbell rang. My husband crept to the front window, peering behind the curtain to see who it was. I could see the fear on his face. "It's my parents," he said, and my blood ran cold. I immediately grabbed our baby and ran upstairs, pausing only to tell him that it was his decision whether to answer the door, since they were his parents, but that I was taking the baby upstairs to hide. As I made my way upstairs, I could hear jostling at the front door, like they were trying to force their way in with a spare key. I am so thankful that we had just changed the locks a few days before, preventing them from getting inside. I hurried upstairs, closed the bedroom door behind me, and locked it. Holding my daughter close, my heart was pounding in my chest. Then came the knock at the bedroom door, and I jumped. My husband's voice came from the other side, calming me. He told me he hadn't answered the door. When I unlocked the door to let him in, I saw that he was trembling, his face pale. He showed me a text message on his phone. "Anyone home?" Followed by another. "You're a coward hiding behind your keyboard." I don't know what would have happened if my husband had answered the door, but I shudder to think about it. After that, both of us blocked them, phone numbers, social media accounts, everything. Thankfully, they moved away to another state. We've had no contact with his parents for almost 2 years now, and our daughter is growing up in a happy, loving environment, free of toxicity. I've since armed myself with knowledge to be less naive about creepy behavior in the future. I've studied narcissism and the harmful psychological effects people can have through gaslighting and invalidation. I hope everyone listening realizes that not all abuse is physical. I've always enjoyed the quiet moments on a cruise, the ones where the world feels still, and the ocean stretches out endlessly in every direction, like you're floating between worlds. It's a kind of peace you can't find anywhere else, surrounded by nothing but water and sky. That's why I was excited when my girlfriend, Emily, and I booked a week-long cruise. We needed a break, and I couldn't wait to experience that serene, isolated feeling. But what I didn't expect was how unsettling that same silence could become when something, or someone, wasn't quite right. It was our second night on the ship when I first noticed her. We were in the dining hall. The usual hum of chatter and clinking silverware filled the air when my eyes drifted across the room and landed on an elderly woman sitting by herself. She wasn't eating or talking, just sitting there, staring down at her hands. Her white hair was neatly pinned up, too formal for the casual atmosphere of the dining room. What struck me was how still she was. In a room full of movement, she appeared frozen, almost like a statue. "Do you see her?" I whispered to Emily, nodding toward the woman. Emily glanced over, frowning slightly. "Yeah, that's kinda sad. Maybe she's waiting for someone." "Maybe," I said, though something about it didn't feel right. I couldn't stop looking at her. The other tables were filled with couples and families chatting and laughing, but she was completely alone. No one even seemed to notice her, not even a waiter checking in. We finished our dinner and left the dining hall, but I didn't think much more about the woman that night. I assumed she was just a solo traveler, or perhaps someone who'd lost their companion during the trip. It was sad, but not out of the ordinary. The next night, however, when we returned for dinner, she was there again. Sitting in the same seat, wearing the same outfit, staring at her hands just like before. "That's weird," I muttered, leaning closer to Emily. "She's still sitting there." Emily shrugged. "Maybe she likes that spot." I wasn't convinced. Something about the way she sat so perfectly still gave me an uneasy feeling. And once again, no one seemed to pay attention to her. No waiter, no fellow passengers, nothing. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake the image of her sitting there. It was like she didn't belong. The ship was alive with activity. Poolside parties, karaoke in the lounge, live music at the bar. But she wasn't part of any of it. She was just there, on the edges of it all, existing in her own silent world. The next day, We spent most of our time lounging by the pool and exploring the ship. It was a beautiful day, and for a while, I forgot about the woman. But later that afternoon, as we made our way to one of the lower decks to grab a drink, I saw her again. She was sitting alone on a bench near the window, looking out at the ocean. The light from the setting sun cast long shadows across the hallway, and she was bathed in a golden glow that somehow made her seem even more out of place. Once again, she didn't move. She just sat there, staring ahead with that same blank expression. That's the third time I've seen her, I whispered to Emily, feeling a knot of unease forming in my stomach. Always sitting alone, never talking to anyone. Emily glanced at the woman, but didn't seem as bothered by it. Maybe she's just shy, or maybe she likes being alone. Some people do. I nodded, but the feeling didn't go away. The ship was full of life, but she seemed disconnected from all of it, like she was just a ghost passing through. That night, after dinner, I couldn't stop thinking about her. As we walked back to our cabin, I decided to ask one of the crew members about her. We passed a young woman in uniform near the elevator, and I stopped her. "Excuse me," I said, trying to sound casual. "There's an older woman I've seen around the ship. She's always sitting alone, white hair, kind of dressed up. Do you know if she's okay?" The crew member's smile faltered for just a second, but it was enough for me to notice. She glanced around before answering. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not sure who you're referring to. We have a lot of passengers." I frowned. "She's been in the dining hall the last 2 nights, always in the same spot." The crew member gave me a tight-lipped smile. "I'll make a note to check on her. But if you don't mind, we ask that guests not disturb other passengers' privacy." Her response didn't sit right with me. It was too vague, like she was brushing me off, but I didn't push it. Emily was already tugging on my arm, urging me to let it go. "Just forget about it," Emily said as we reached our cabin. "She's probably fine. You're overthinking it." But I couldn't forget about it. The next night, I insisted we sit near the woman's table in the dining hall. I wanted to get a closer look, maybe even strike up a conversation. I figured if I could talk to her, it would put my mind at ease. Maybe she really was just a quiet, lonely traveler. When we walked into the dining hall, I immediately spotted her, sitting in the same chair, at the same table, wearing the same outfit. I led Emily to a table just a few feet away, close enough that I could watch her without being too obvious. She hadn't moved since we'd come in, her hands resting lightly on the table in front of her, her head slightly bowed as if she were deep in thought. We ordered our food, and I spent most of the meal sneaking glances in her direction. The more I watched, the more unnerved I became. It wasn't just her stillness that was unsettling. It was the fact that no one seemed to notice her. The waiters walked past her table without stopping. The other guests didn't so much as glance her way. It was like she didn't exist. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, determined to go over and say something, even if it was just a polite hello. But as I approached her table, I stopped in my tracks. Her chair was empty. I blinked, disoriented. I'd seen her just moments ago. I looked around the dining hall, but there was no sign of her. The place was bustling with people, but the woman had vanished, as if she'd never been there at all. I turned back to Emily, who was watching me with wide eyes. "What happened? Where did she go?" I don't know," I stammered, feeling the weight of the room pressing in on me. "She was just here." We left the dining hall quickly, both of us shaken by the sudden disappearance. Back in the cabin, I tried to make sense of it. How could she have disappeared so quickly? If she'd left the dining hall, I would have seen her. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, trying to figure out where she could have gone. But no matter how many times I thought it over, I couldn't come up with a plausible explanation. The next morning, I asked one of the crew members about her, describing her in detail. But once again, I received the same vague response. No one fitting that description is listed as a passenger on the ship. For the rest of the cruise, I didn't see her again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still somewhere on the ship, watching, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, when the ship was quiet and the only sound was the gentle rocking of the waves, I could almost feel her presence just out of sight. It was as if she were still sitting at that table, still staring at her hands, waiting for someone to notice her. To this day, I still don't know who or what that woman was, but I've been on plenty of cruises since then. And each time, I find myself scanning the dining hall, looking for her. And every time, I wonder if she's still out there, quietly waiting for someone to see her, because I did. Some backstory before I dive in. I only learned about this situation a week ago, but it seems to have been going on for years. I'm 24, female, and my partner is also 24, male. His ex-girlfriend before me, who's an important part of the story, is also 24. Then there's her ex-boyfriend, who is 35 and was her partner just before she dated my boyfriend. So, to start the story, I began going regularly to a goth club and attending their weekly events. Two of my best friends went there often, so I figured I should try breaking out of my shell and stop being the depressed hermit who never leaves the house. I wanted to socialize and make more than just my two friends, so I started going with the goal of meeting new people, and I did. It was going well, considering I'm normally pretty shy and anxious, but I began feeling comfortable enough there that I could open up to people approaching me and make new friends. One night, I kept noticing this goth guy with makeup and platform boots. First, I noticed because of his cool cape, and second, because he always seemed to be somewhere nearby. The club's pretty big, with multiple rooms both inside and outside, so at first, I didn't think much of it. Eventually, he came up to me to say hello, and I asked him if I knew him since he had been around a lot that night. He said, "Yeah, you're Nero's girlfriend, right?" I replied, "Yeah." Then I asked, "So you're a friend of Nero's then?" He laughed and said, "Well, kind of. We actually just have a mutual ex-girlfriend. Now, all of my boyfriend's exes are pretty awful except for one, based on what I've heard from him, his family, and his friends. So I really wasn't interested in hearing more at that point. I just said it was nice meeting him and quickly went back to my friends. The very next week, he was there again, and when he saw me, he said hello. That's when I realized I hadn't actually asked his name. After he greeted me, I said, "I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name." He responded, "Oh, I'm sorry. I was so drunk last time. I'm embarrassed I even brought up Marie, but my name is Gerald." Hearing Marie's name made me tense up because she was the girl Nero dated before me. She still openly admitted to having feelings for him and had tried making advances several times since we started dating. Thankfully, Nero shut all that down. I trust him, but I really dislike Marie. I sarcastically said, "Oh, so your mutual ex is my favorite one?" He nodded, a little embarrassed. "Yeah, be careful with Marie. She's a dangerous one." He talked a bit more about his previous relationship with Marie, mostly about how manipulative she was, how much she cheated on him, just generally bad-mouthing her. He kept stuttering, seeming a bit awkward and shy, so I wrote him off as being harmless, and we finished our conversation and didn't speak again for the rest of the night. Over the next couple of months, I'm there every week as usual, but suddenly so is Gerald. He hadn't been someone that regularly attended before, but I really wasn't feeling paranoid about it yet because 1, he seems so awkward, shy, and innocent when I talk to him. 2, it is like the only goth club around. Maybe he just discovered he liked the place and was also just trying to make new friends. So I told myself that it would be irrational to think he was there for me. I have PTSD and anxiety disorder, so it's not uncommon that I have irrational, intrusive, sometimes paranoid thoughts. So I choose to ignore him. One afternoon, Marie calls Nero as he and I were laying down and watching a movie. She wanted to catch up and see how he's doing. They had been friends for years before they dated, and while I don't particularly like her, I trust him and I would never try to dictate who he can and can't be friends with. He has a pretty short, casual conversation, asks if she needs anything, and then hangs up the phone. I told him, "Oh, that reminds me, I forgot to tell you I met one of Marie's exes a little while ago." He laughs and asks which one. I said his name was Gerald, and my boyfriend's smile immediately fell from his face and his eyes went huge. All the color drained from his face. "Did you say you met Gerald? Where did you meet him? What did he say?" Feeling panicked by his reaction, I'm stuttering. Nora and I were at Goth Club one night, and he asked if I was your girlfriend. My boyfriend starts freaking out. I should mention, he has several severe mental disorders, and one of them being a panic disorder. So he's on the verge of having a panic attack, and I'm trying to calm him down in all of my confusion. When I finally get him calmed down enough, he starts to explain. Before him and Marie dated 5 years ago, she had broken up with Gerald for having abusive and obsessive behavior. Afterwards, Gerald began stalking Marie. He would wait outside of her house, wait for her to leave, and follow her everywhere she went, never confronting her, just watching and writing it all down in a journal. Writing down what she was doing, how it made him feel, writing down all the little things she did throughout the day. In this journal, he also wrote about how he was sorry for cheating on her, telling her about the 2 girls he cheated on her with, a 16-year-old and a 17-year-old, and he was 30 years old at that time. It was already odd in my opinion that he was a 30-year-old dating the 19-year-old Marie, but he also cheated on her with underage girls, and he openly admitted it in this journal. And when Marie started dating Nero, he began following Nero as well. Another important thing to know about my boyfriend is that he has schizophrenia. Nothing could possibly be worse to a paranoid schizophrenic trying to create stability in his life than an actual stalker following him around and making him feel that much more paranoid. Gerald followed them around, writing about both of them in the journal. He printed screenshots from their social media accounts and pictures of them he'd taken, pasting them into this horrifying journal. And then Gerald waited for Marie and Nero to be at her house, and then he left this journal full of horrors at her doorstep. Obviously, both of them panicked when they read the contents. Nero begged Marie to go to the police, but she didn't want to. Something about her child and being scared of it making her look like an unfit mother. I don't know. Nero broke things off with Marie due to incompatibility, and a year later we met and ended up dating pretty quickly. But unbeknownst to him, Gerald had never stopped stalking Nero. We discovered he would make fake accounts just to try to check and see what Nero was doing since he'd blocked all of Gerald's accounts that he knew of. We found that Gerald had added Nora, mine and Nero's close mutual friend. And, of course, on our Facebook, there are lots of pictures of the 3 of us together, which is how Gerald found me. And I typically accept friend requests with a decent number of mutual friends. So Gerald had added me from there before we'd met in person, realizing that I was Nero's current partner. I'm pretty open about a lot of things, which I'm now realizing can be a negative thing with most of my posts set to public. I'm always posting pictures of Nora and myself at his goth club every week, so he knew that he could run into me there, and I'm sure hoping that Nero or Marie would be there as well. But since learning about all of this, I started looking back through photographs from the weekly events, and I'm finding him somewhere in the background near me numerous times without me knowing. He played the shy, awkward card, and I really fell for it. I was stupid and fell for it. Yesterday, talking to other friends about my discoveries, showing them who he is, even multiples of them have said, "Oh yeah, I thought you were friends with him because I always saw him following you and Nora around." I felt so nauseous I wanted to vomit. I somehow was so oblivious. I didn't even realize that my boyfriend's ex's ex had been stalking me, following me through the club, appearing in every room I'm in when I'm in it. Nero showed me pictures of the journal entries and it was horrifyingly scary. My stomach dropped and I felt sick. How could I have been so obliviously naive? My safe space no longer feels like it's safe anymore. He just spreads his obsession, continually growing and latching onto others involved while he's still following Marie. Even after all these years, she still feels afraid every time she leaves her house, and now I find myself afraid to leave mine. I'm terrified of going back to that club and running into him again. I'm scared for my friends who still attend. How much worse is his obsession going to get? Who else is he following? Has he been following me home? Does he know where I live now, too? I've been feeling incredibly paranoid and unsafe lately. I haven't left my boyfriend's house since I found out. I'm afraid to be alone in my own home. I know I won't be going back to that club for a long time. I asked Marie to take the journal to the police and get a restraining order. I want one too, but I'm not sure I have enough evidence to back up the need for it. But she definitely has enough with that journal. I just hope that one day, I won't feel like I have to constantly look over my shoulder every time I leave my house. It was early March when I decided to take my camper out for a midweek camping trip. Living in Illinois, the state is mostly flat with little in terms of scenic hiking or camping, but my house is surrounded by some dirt paths that are big enough for my truck and camper to fit, so I often find myself out there for a couple of nights a few times a month. My favorite spot was down a small trail leading to a secluded lake. The lake itself was quite large, but the area I liked was tucked away, far from the crowds. I drove out in the morning, detached the camper, and grabbed my bag for a hike. I knew there were no trails in the area, but walking along the lake seemed like a relaxing way to enjoy the outdoors and avoid getting lost. The lake was smaller than I'd hoped, and it was surrounded by swampy ground, so I decided to set up my tent further into the forest where it was dry. After a couple of hours of being there, I started feeling a little bored, so I decided to walk around the pond. The forest was beautiful, but there were no distinctive landmarks, so it felt like the same woods all around. I walked around, but didn't find much. By the time I made my way back to camp, the sun was almost gone. I used my fire starter to get a campfire going and heated up some food, but not long after sunset, I noticed a light across the pond. It was in the trees, but in the same place where I'd walked earlier, and I knew there was nothing there just an hour ago. At first, it was a little unsettling to think there might be someone else nearby, but considering how few people camp on this trail, the odds of it being a random person weren't high. I continued on with my night, occasionally glancing across the pond. As it got darker, the light became clearer, and I realized it wasn't a campfire. It looked like a flashlight. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but after an hour or so, I saw the light flicker and go out. I stared at the dark forest across the pond, waiting for the light to come back, but it never did. A chill ran through me, but I didn't know what to make of it. The rest of the night was quiet, and I slept without any further incidents. When morning came, I decided to walk around the other side of the pond where I saw the light the night before, hoping to get some answers. It didn't take long to find the source, a flashlight lying in the grass. The batteries were drained, but the flashlight was practically brand new, with no noticeable wear and tear. I looked around but found nothing else. After some thought, I left the flashlight where it was and headed back to my camp. As I approached, I froze when I saw two men standing by my fire pit. Another man came out of the trees and joined them. From where I was, I could only see that they looked like adults, but I didn't get a good enough look to see much else. I was too scared to speak or yell. I just watched as they started rummaging through my things. One of the men then turned and scanned the tree line, and when his gaze landed on me, it sent a chill through my spine. He stared for a moment, then walked off and disappeared into the trees. My heart racing, I quickly ran further into the forest, away from the pond, not sure if they were following me. I ran for about 15 minutes, then made my way back toward my car, lucky to have made it safely. I was terrified, but by the time I got back, I realized I had lost all my belongings. I called the police, but the investigation didn't lead to anything. They were never able to find the men or retrieve any evidence. I still think about that flashlight often. Was it theirs, or was it someone else's? I try to convince myself it was just a robbery, but deep down, I know I came dangerously close to never making it out of that forest. It was early December. I was spending my day off at home, relaxing by the fireplace. It was way too cold and snowy outside for my liking. I managed to get a few things done around the house, but mostly, it was a quiet, restful day. I had the news on in the background, listening to updates about the high winds and potential blizzards expected to hit later that evening. By 5 p.m., I could already see the weather worsening outside. I sat on the couch and switched to a different channel. Around 7, I heard the wind battering against the house, and it really sounded like a full-blown blizzard. I got up and walked to the window facing the backyard to check how bad it was. At first, all I could see was snow swirling to the ground with almost no visibility. But then, I noticed something else. A figure walking through my backyard. My backyard was large, and there was no fence, so it wasn't unusual to see someone out there. But with the blizzard raging, It was strange to see anyone walking at all. The person was walking at a regular pace, heading toward the far end of my yard, where the snow and darkness soon swallowed them up, obscuring any further view. I stayed by the window for a minute, trying to catch another glimpse and figure out what they were doing, but I didn't see anything more. I felt concerned for them, but I also couldn't understand why anyone would be out there, especially in those conditions. The end of my yard led to a road, but it didn't go anywhere for miles, which made walking it on foot nearly impossible in such a storm. I returned to the TV, but the thought of that person still lingered in my mind. Just 5 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. I walked over and cracked it open. A man stood there, bundled up in a heavy winter jacket. His nose was bright red, and his face was pale, like he'd been out in the cold for a long time. I couldn't be sure if this was the same person I'd seen in my backyard, but my immediate guess was that it was. "How can I help you?" I asked. The man gave a humble smile and spoke through chattering teeth, explaining that he was waiting for a ride to pick him up. He asked if he could come inside just to shelter from the cold until his ride arrived. I took a moment to respond because, honestly, I was considering it, given the state of the weather. It's easy to say you'd never let a stranger into your home, but when they're practically freezing to death on your doorstep and asking for help, the decision isn't as simple. I told him he could wait on the porch, which had an overhang that protected from the snow, and I offered him an old jacket of mine if he needed it. The man didn't look thrilled about that offer, but he just nodded and moved off to the side, sitting down on the chair I had outside. I closed and locked the door, then went upstairs to grab the jacket. It was way too big for me and in pretty bad condition, but of course that didn't matter in this situation. I grabbed it and walked downstairs, about to unlock the door and hand it to him, but something stopped me just before I did. I can't quite explain it, but it made me hesitate. I leaned over to look through the peephole. To my shock, the man was standing right against the door with his hand on the handle, like he was ready to push it open the moment I unlocked it. My heart rate spiked as I stepped back a couple of paces and quietly pulled my phone out to call 911. I whispered into the phone, still staring at the door, my heart pounding as I knew what was waiting on the other side. Once I confirmed with the police that they were on their way, I slowly crept over to the peephole again. The man was gone. He wasn't on the porch or anywhere in my front yard. He had simply vanished, almost like he knew I had called the police. Nothing else happened that night. There were no signs of him anywhere, and he never showed up again. What he would have done if I had opened that door, I can't say for sure, but I'm just glad I didn't find out. I can only hope he never comes back. I ran straight for it, grasped the handle and wrenched it open. The moment I crossed the threshold, the whispers stopped. I stumbled into my house, gasping. The air was still. The world was normal again, but something was wrong. My reflection in the hallway mirror wasn't moving. It was smiling. I never planned on stopping. The train ride was supposed to be simple. A late-night journey home after visiting a friend in the city. I had taken this route dozens of times before, watching the blurred lights of distant towns flicker past the windows as I sipped my coffee. The train was nearly empty that night, just a handful of passengers scattered across the dimly lit car. Then the train stopped. Not at a station, not at a crossing, just stopped. The overhead lights flickered, and the intercom crackled to life. Unexpected delay. We will be resuming shortly. I checked my phone. No signal. Outside the window, nothing but darkness. The train tracks stretched endlessly into the void, flanked by a dense wall of trees. Then I saw the platform. It wasn't there before. A small, abandoned station, its roof sagging under years of neglect. The sign hanging above the platform was rusted, the name of the station obscured by time and grime. The platform itself was empty. At least that's what I thought at first. Then movement. A figure stepped out of the shadows, standing motionless beneath the flickering station light. I pressed my forehead against the glass, squinting. The figure was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, a long coat, a hat pulled low over its face. It didn't move, Didn't acknowledge the train or the passengers inside. Just stood there waiting. Then another figure appeared. And another. One by one, they stepped onto the platform, all facing the train. Silent. Still. A chill crawled up my spine. Something about them felt wrong. Their proportions, their stillness, the way they seemed to appear from nowhere. The train's lights flickered again. When they came back on, the figures were closer. A voice came over the intercom, low and distorted. "Do not disembark." The lights flickered off again. When they turned back on, the figures were right outside the windows. I jerked away, my heart hammering. The entire train car was silent, the other passengers frozen in place, their faces pale in the dim light. No one spoke, no one moved. A hand pressed against the glass, fingers too long, skin too pale. The train lurched forward. The lights snapped off completely, plunging us into darkness. For a moment, all I could hear was the rhythmic thudding of my own pulse, the distant hum of the engine struggling to life. And then, a whisper, right next to my ear. "Next time, step off." The lights returned. The platform was gone. The station had vanished into the night. I didn't move for the rest of the ride. When the train finally pulled into my stop, I practically ran onto the platform, breathing in the cool night air, desperate to get away. I tried searching for that station later. There was nothing. No record of it on any map. No mention of it anywhere online. But sometimes, when I take that train at night, I catch glimpses of something in the distance. A flickering light, a rusted sign, and figures standing in the dark, waiting for the next train to stop. Last night, I made a mistake. Curiosity had been gnawing at me for weeks. So when I saw the faint glow in the distance, I did the one thing I swore I wouldn't do. I stood up, walked toward the doors. As if expecting me, the train slowed to a stop. The intercom remained silent this time, no warning given. My heart pounded as I stepped closer, peering through the window. The figures were there, unmoving. One of them tilted its head. A single chime rang out, though there was no clock in sight. The train doors hissed open. Cold air rushed in, thick and damp, carrying the scent of earth and decay. My breath fogged in front of me. I hesitated at the threshold. Then something moved inside the train. A passenger sitting across from me. A woman in a red coat. I hadn't noticed her before, but now she was staring at me. Her expression a mix of horror and pity. "Don't go," she whispered. "They want you to." The figures outside stepped closer. Their heads tilted, their forms shifting slightly, as if adjusting to my hesitation. Then they smiled. Their mouths were too wide, too many teeth. Their bodies twitched with unnatural movements, jerking forward in short, stuttered bursts. The woman in red grabbed my wrist. "Close the door. Now." My body reacted before my mind could, slamming the emergency button. The doors shut just as the nearest figure lunged forward. The train jolted into motion. The station vanished into the night once more. I collapsed into my seat, my breath ragged. The woman in red watched me for a long moment. Then, without another word, she stood up and walked to the far end of the car, disappearing into the next section. I never saw her again, but I know she saved me, and I know deep down that the next time the train stops, I might not be strong enough to resist stepping off. I had just left the West Coast and moved to Missouri for college. During my second year, I started seeing a guy who was attending the police academy. After his graduation, he became a guard at the South Center Correctional Prison. He was nearly 10 years older than me, and right from the start, there were signs I should have paid more attention to, but I didn't. For instance, he had gotten a 16-year-old pregnant the year before and had a son he didn't want me to meet. He also had a tendency to start bar fights if I talked to other guys. Before Thanksgiving, he bought me a golden lab puppy, which I named Roxy. He kept her while I flew back home. My parents and I decided I would move back to California after the semester ended because the small Midwest town wasn't for me. So many of my sorority sisters seemed uninterested in their education, instead focusing on trapping men into marriage by lying about being on birth control and getting pregnant. When I told my boyfriend I was leaving at the end of the year, he completely lost it. He was frantic, calling me repeatedly, first screaming, then crying, then threatening me. He told me that if I didn't come back, he'd kill the puppy. When I finally returned, I asked about Roxy, and he told me she had gotten sick and died. But later, when we visited his parents' house, his mother pulled me aside and revealed that after our Thanksgiving conversation, he had deliberately run over the puppy with his truck. A few weeks later, after final exams, my mom flew in to help me pack my car for the move back home. On the final night, my boyfriend came by to say goodbye. He'd already tried everything to keep me in Missouri, including proposing with a cheap, ugly Marique diamond ring, which I remarked looked like it came from Walmart. His response was, "What does it matter if it did? It wasn't for you anyway," as he tossed the ring into the back seat. I firmly told him that while I was open to trying long distance, I was leaving Missouri for good. He then locked the truck doors, grabbed my purse, threw it on the driver's seat, and drove off with me still in the car. His home was 2 hours away, in a tiny trailer park town near Rolla. I begged and pleaded, my phone constantly buzzing. Likely my mom, while I told him she would call the police. "And tell them what?" he asked. "She doesn't know my plates or where I live. Plus, I'm a cop." Once we arrived at his trailer, he locked my purse in a small room. The night that followed was a blur of horror, parts of which I've blocked out. The only details I remember clearly are being naked and bound. In the morning, after he untied me, he made breakfast and mentioned he had to go to work. I asked when I could call my mom. I even tried to play the "I'm staying here with you" card, pretending to share good news with her. He gave me that unsettling smile of his and said we'd talk about it later, but that I wasn't going anywhere. Once he left, I quickly dressed and tried the door. It was locked from the outside with a padlock on both doors. There wasn't a soul around for miles, except for his aunt, who lived in a trailer on the property. So, I broke the kitchen window, climbed out, and ran to her trailer, pounding on her door. I didn't know her other than the occasional wave and said, "I'm Kevin's girlfriend and need to use your phone. It's an emergency." I pushed myself into her door because she was going to let me in whether she wanted to or not. I called my dad at home because I couldn't remember my mom's cell number and told him I was okay. Instead of concerns from my parents, I got yelled at that I would miss my plane and made my mother upset that I disappeared to go off with my boyfriend. My parents didn't quite understand what I had just gone through. I tried explaining again, but I was too scared Kevin might come back early. So I asked his aunt to call his mother. She hesitated and then caught her saying, "There's a strange girl here who says she needs to speak with you." I explained the situation and that my purse was locked inside. She said to hang tight and to keep the drapes shut. The aunt was an old lady and not much of a talker except for the occasional remark about Kevin being an angel. When his mother finally arrived, she had my purse. I didn't ask how. My phone, of course, was dead, but luckily I was alive with an escape plan. His mom drove me the 2 hours back to the hotel and she didn't say much, and when she did it was about her son being special and he was a sweet boy with good intentions, and something about when he had an eye on something pretty, he usually had to have it. I knew I needed to get out of the state ASAP. I finally got home, and my parents didn't quite understand the fact that I got kidnapped. They aren't typical loving parents, I know others have, but they understood quickly how Kevin was a problem. Luckily, he didn't know where I lived, but he got hold of the house phone number and called non-stop. Both my cell and phone number were off the hook and my voicemail box form. My dad and I went to the police station and filed for a restraining order shortly after. I started dating someone new and posted on Facebook that we would be going to Disneyland. But last minute we changed plans and headed to go skiing in our friend's cabin. That same week, my father got a call from his private Disney club that a man had been asking for me every day waiting outside the entrance. It was Kevin. My father told him it was my stalker. And, thanks to the power of Disney, security escorted him off the ground and he was put in the Disney blacklist forever. Finally, during a New Year's Eve party, I heard about him from a friend who lived in the same town where Kevin had gotten a 15-year-old girl pregnant, right after I had left for California and he ended up marrying her. It scares me to think about what could have been and how lucky I was to escape. Kevin, Let's never meet again. It appeared overnight. When I went to bed, there was nothing, just the bare wall of my apartment, blank and undisturbed. But when I woke up, there it was. A door. At first, I thought I was dreaming. I sat up in bed, rubbing my eyes, staring at the unfamiliar structure standing where nothing had been before. The door was old, wooden, with peeling black paint and a tarnished brass handle. No frame, no hinges that I could see. Just a door embedded into the wall, like it had always been there. I didn't touch it, not at first. I checked my lease agreement, searched my floor plan. Nothing mentioned an extra door. I knocked on the wall beside it, solid. But when I pressed my ear against the wood, something shifted on the other side. Something moved. I backed away, my pulse hammering. My apartment was small. I knew every inch of it. There was no space for another room, no reason for another door. And yet it was there. That night, I dreamt of hands knocking from the other side. By the third day, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I put a chair against the door, stared at it for hours. The knob never turned, but I could feel it. The presence. Watching. Waiting. Then the whispers started. Late at night, just as I was drifting off, I'd hear them. Soft, unintelligible. Something speaking just beneath the threshold. I pressed my pillow over my ears, tried to block it out, but the words slithered through the fabric, curling around my thoughts like smoke. Let me in. I stopped sleeping. On the sixth night, I woke to find the chair moved. Not knocked over, not pushed aside, just moved, like someone had carefully dragged it back, inch by inch, away from the door. I didn't remember falling asleep. I didn't remember getting out of bed, but my footprints were there, leading from my mattress to the door, bare, imprinted in the dust. The whispers grew louder that night. I held my breath, gripping my sheets, forcing my body to stay still as the voice crept through the dark. I'm coming through. Something pressed against the door from the other side. The wood groaned. The handle rattled. I ran. I left that night, taking nothing with me. I drove without direction, just needing to be away, needing space, needing air. I checked into a motel, locked the door, barricaded myself inside. By morning, exhaustion overtook me, and I collapsed onto the bed. When I woke up, I turned over, rubbing my eyes, and froze. The door was there, the same peeling paint, the same tarnished brass handle, standing in the corner of the motel room, as if it had followed me, as if it always would. This time, the knob turned. I didn't wait. I grabbed my things and ran. I got back into my car, not caring where I was going as long as it was far away. The highway stretched before me, endless and unfamiliar, the morning light barely breaking through the thick clouds. For hours I drove. Towns passed. Cities faded behind me. The farther I got, the lighter I felt, like maybe I had finally outrun it. Then I stopped for gas. I stepped out of my car, stretching, trying to shake the lingering anxiety from my shoulders. The gas station was empty, just a single attendant inside, staring blankly at a flickering television. I filled my tank, went inside for a coffee, and when I returned, the door was waiting, standing next to my car. The same black paint, the same brass handle. It had followed me. It had found me again. My hands trembled as I reached for my keys. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let it catch up to me. Then the gas station attendant spoke. "You saw it, didn't you?" I turned slowly, my heart pounding. He was still staring at the television, but his face was pale, his fingers gripping the counter. "What?" I managed to whisper. He exhaled shakily. "You need to leave before it opens." I didn't ask him how he knew. I didn't need to. The handle on the door rattled. I got back in my car, floored the gas pedal, and sped off. I drove until nightfall, until exhaustion forced me to stop at another motel, this time miles away, in a town whose name I didn't bother to remember. I stepped into my room, locking every bolt, checking every corner. I sat on the edge of the bed, breathing deeply, trying to steady my hands. And then I turned. There, in the corner of the room, was the door. The moment I heard the lock click behind me, I knew this open house had just turned into a trap. What I didn't know was that the next few hours would push me to the absolute limits of my wit and will to survive. I'm Emily, a real estate agent in a small town just outside of Portland. It was supposed to be an ordinary Saturday afternoon, showing a charming Victorian home to some potential buyers. But as I stood there, heart pounding, staring at the now locked front door, I realized that nothing about this was normal. Started out like any other open house. I arrived early to set up, placing fresh flowers on the dining room table and pulling back the curtains to let in the warm autumn light. The house was gorgeous. Original hardwood floors, intricate moldings, and a bit remote, tucked away at the end of a long tree-lined drive that only added to its charm. My first clients were scheduled to arrive at 2 p.m., but at 1:45, a man showed up. He was tall, well-dressed, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Am I too early?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk. I flashed him my best realtor smile. "Not at all. I'm Emily. Would you like to start the tour?" He nodded and followed me into the foyer. As I launched into my usual spiel about the home's features, I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. The way he was looking at me, not the house. The fact that he hadn't asked a single question. We were in the kitchen when I heard the front door click shut. Odd, I thought. I was sure I'd left it open for the other clients. "Excuse me," I said. "I should check on that." But as I turned to leave the kitchen, he grabbed my arm. His grip was like iron, his earlier charm evaporating. "I don't think so," he said, his voice now cold and commanding. "You're not going anywhere." Fear shot through me as the terrible truth sank in. This man wasn't here to buy a house. He was here for me. I acted on pure instinct, bringing my knee up hard into his gut. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening just enough for me to break free. I ran for the front door, my heels pounding on the hardwood floor. But when I reached it, my heart sank. Locked, and not with the simple latch I had used earlier. This was serious hardware, likely installed while I was distracted with the tour. I spun around, looking for another way out. The man was at the end of the hallway, recovering and looking furious. "That wasn't very nice, Emily," he growled. "Now we're going to have to do this the hard way." I bolted for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy on the old wood. My mind raced. I needed a weapon, a phone, anything. I ducked into the master bedroom, slamming the door and wedging a chair under the handle. It wouldn't hold him for long, but it might buy me some time. The room was large and with tall windows overlooking the backyard. For a moment, I considered trying to climb out, but a quick glance showed it was too far to jump. I'd break an ankle at best, and then I'd be helpless. I grabbed my cell phone from my pocket, but my heart sank. No signal, of course. The remote location that had seemed so quaint earlier now felt like a death sentence. The door shuddered as he threw his weight against it. The chair scraped across the floor. It wouldn't hold much longer. I looked around desperately for a weapon. My eyes fell on a heavy crystal vase on the dresser. Not ideal, but it was better than nothing. I gripped it tightly, positioning myself beside the door. With a final crash, the door burst open. As he stumbled in, I swung the vase with all my might. It connected with a sickening crunch, and he went down hard. For a moment, I stood there, panting, the broken vase still clutched in my hand. Was he dead? The rise and fall of his chest told me no. Just unconscious. But for how long? I had to find a way out, and fast. I searched his pockets hoping for the key to the front door, but came up empty. He must have hidden it somewhere in the house. As I turned to leave the room, something caught my eye. A small notebook had fallen from his jacket. I picked it up, my blood running cold as I flipped through the pages. It was full of names, dates, and addresses. Other real estate agents. I realized other victims. This wasn't some random attack. This man was a predator, and he'd been doing this for a long time. And now I was his latest target. The sound of him stirring snapped me back to reality. I didn't have much time. I ran down the stairs, my mind racing. The front door was out, but there had to be another way. I remembered the back door in the kitchen. It was worth a shot. But as I reached for the handle, my heart sank. Also locked with the same heavy-duty hardware as the front. That's when I heard him. His footsteps slow and menacing on the stairs. "Oh, Emily," he called out, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Come out now and I'll make it quick." I bit back a scream of frustration. Think, Emily, think. My eyes fell on the cellar door. It was a long shot, but it might be my only chance. I yanked it open and descended into the darkness, pulling the door shut behind me. The cellar was pitch black and smelled of damp earth. I fumbled for my phone, using its dim light to navigate. Old boxes and dusty furniture loomed like specters in the gloom. And there, on the far wall, I saw it. A small window just big enough for a person to squeeze through. I made my way towards it, hope rising in my chest. But as I reached it, my heart sank. It was sealed shut, probably painted over years ago. Above, I could hear him moving through the house, calling my name. He'd figure out where I was soon enough. I was trapped. No, I refused to accept that. I was not going to die in this cellar. Another name in that monster's notebook. I looked around frantically for something, anything I could use. My light fell on an old toolbox. I rummaged through it, my hands shaking. Screwdrivers, hammers, and there, at the bottom, a crowbar. I grabbed it and turned back to the window. It was now or never. I wedged the crowbar into the seam and pushed with all my might. The wood creaked and groaned but didn't budge. I could hear him in the kitchen now, his footsteps right above me. Any second, he'd find the cellar door. With a desperate surge of strength, I threw my whole weight onto the crowbar. There was a loud crack, and suddenly, blessedly, the window popped open. Fresh air rushed in, along with the sound of approaching sirens. My 2 p.m. clients must have called the police when they found the house locked up. I scrambled through the window, scraping my arms and tearing my clothes. But I didn't care. I was out. I was free. I ran towards the sound of the sirens, not daring to look back. As I reached the front of the house, I saw police cars pulling up, officers jumping out with their guns drawn. "Help!" I screamed, waving my arms. "He's inside. He tried to kill me." What happened next was a blur. Police statements, paramedics checking me over, and my boss arriving, pale and wide-eyed in shock. The man, it turned out, was wanted in 3 states for similar attacks. They found a kill kit in his car, along with trophies from previous victims. As I sat in the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over my shoulders, the full reality of what had happened began to sink in. I had come face to face with a serial killer, and I had survived. In the days and weeks that followed, I jumped at every shadow, flinched at every unexpected sound. I couldn't do an open house without breaking into a cold sweat. The physical bruises faded, but the psychological scars ran deep. But slowly, surely, I began to heal. I took self-defense classes. I changed our company's policies to ensure that no agent would ever have to be alone in a house with a stranger again. And I told my story, hoping it might prevent someone else from going through what I had. Now, when I walk into a house, I always make sure I know where the nearest exit is. I trust my instincts when something feels wrong, and I never, ever take my safety for granted. Because I learned the hard way that sometimes the most dangerous thing in an empty house isn't a faulty foundation or outdated wiring. Sometimes, it's the person who walks through the door with a smile that doesn't quite reach their eyes. I still sell houses. I still love the joy of helping someone find their dream home. But now, I do it with my eyes wide open, always aware that danger can lurk in the most unexpected places. And every time I hand over a set of keys to a new homeowner, I say a silent prayer of thanks, because I know how close I came to never doing that again. So if you're ever at an open house and something feels off, listen to that little voice in your head. It might just save your life. I know it saved mine. When I finished college, the Great Recession was in full swing. Despite graduating with a high GPA and solid internship experience, it took me 2 years to find a full-time job in my field. During those 2 years, I felt isolated, lost, and adrift. In retrospect, it makes sense that this was when I brushed up against what might have been my first encounter with a ghost. At the time, newspapers were full of stories about boomerang kids, young adults moving back in with their parents to weather the economic storm. I couldn't bring myself to do that, though. I had just broken up with my boyfriend, and the thought of returning to my childhood bedroom felt suffocating. I didn't want to deal with the pity, the claustrophobia, or the crushing sense of failure. Instead, I worked 3 jobs to make ends meet. I could pay my rent, but I quickly fell into a deep depression. I kept strange hours, which made it hard to find time for friends. One of my jobs was transcribing recordings for a youth psychologist. I was paid to transcribe the psychologist's evaluations of his patients. For confidentiality reasons, I won't discuss the specifics of those recordings, but one thing I did notice was how many of the kids grew up in small, dying towns in rural areas. I lived in the city and hadn't spent much time exploring outside of it. But out of loneliness and depression, I started driving on my free time. Sometimes I drove aimlessly. Other times, I drove near the towns where the kids in the recordings were from. I passed ghost towns, isolated mountain ranges, and old mines. On one occasion, I got my car stuck in the mud outside an abandoned cemetery and had to hike back to the road to flag someone down to help me. The emptiness of those places seemed to stick with me. Sometimes I'd stop my car in the middle of the road, take off my shoes, feel the heat of the asphalt under my feet, and just stare at the horizon for an hour, with no one passing by. Even when I returned home, I couldn't shake the feeling of the desert. Felt like I was changed somehow. I also noticed something else about the psych evaluations. Almost all the kids talked about the supernatural. They had ghost stories, UFO stories, and even a few skinwalker tales, all from the places I had been driving through. I'd never been a believer in the supernatural, but after spending time in these eerie, lonely places, I could see why they believed in such things. There's a major river in the southern part of the state that showed up in a lot of their stories. One day, while browsing an independent bookstore, I found an older book full of stories and legends about the river. On a whim, I bought it. Most of the stories were forgettable, but one stuck with me. A journal entry from a miner who had lived in the area in the 1800s. He wrote that one night, while in camp, he looked over at the river and saw a group of ghosts walking out of the water and onto the shore. There were no further details, no descriptions of the ghosts, and no indication of how he knew they were ghosts. He didn't say what he did afterward, but that image stayed in my mind. For weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about those ghosts walking out of the river and disappearing into the night. Eventually, I decided I had to see the place for myself. It was far, on the border of another state and along one of the least traveled highways in the country. I felt uneasy as I drove toward it, but there was also a sense of exhilaration. It's hard to explain, but reading those ghost stories gave me a sense of possibility, a sense that there was more to the world than I had previously believed. I believed in next to nothing at this point in my life, but maybe I could believe in this. It even seemed likely. The world felt dark, and this seemed like a confirmation of that feeling. When I arrived at the river, there was no one there. I parked my car, hiked through the sagebrush, and looked around. It was just a river of muddy water. I sat down on the bank and thought about my life. Why was I going nowhere? When would this end? Had my boyfriend seen this looming nothingness in me, and that was why he had left? I was 24 years old, and I was looking for ghosts. I had maybe even become a ghost myself. Sometimes at night, I felt like I was beginning to fade at the edges, like whatever had made me was gone. Frustrated with myself and with the sun beginning to set, I stood up to leave. I walked back to my car, dreading the long drive home in the dark. When I reached my car, I almost missed it. The light was fading and my mind was on other things, but I happened to fumble my keys getting them into the lock. And as I stooped down to pick them up, I saw it. A set of wet footprints leading to my car. I stood up slowly, tracing their path with my eyes, but I knew where they were going to start, at the edge of the river. My whole body felt cold and light, It was the biggest moment of unreality I had ever experienced, and it washed over me like a wave. The footprints were half faded but very definite outlines of what looked like cowboy boots leading from the river and right up to the passenger door of my car. Then they vanished. There was no sign of where they had gone and no sound either, just the buzz of insects at the water's edge. I didn't wait around to see anything else. I jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and peeled out. I made sure the doors were locked, but somehow I knew it hadn't been a living person who had made those marks. I had hiked out a little bit, but I would have noticed if there had been someone else there, especially if they had approached my car, which was on higher ground and more visible. The adrenaline kept me going the entire drive home. When I got back, I called my friend and we talked for an hour about unimportant gossip. I ordered takeout from the most basic, normal-sounding restaurant I could think of. I put a sitcom on in the background. I don't think I slept at all that night, and shortly after, I was offered a full-time salary job in my field in a much bigger city. I moved that summer and I haven't been back to that river since. I also don't feel comfortable in the desert or in any isolated place. I prefer the busy noise of the city where I can surround myself with friends and it's difficult to get too lost in my own thoughts. But I know there are ghosts. In 2017, my husband was frequently away for work, often gone for weeks at a time in a different city. We were living in a one-bedroom apartment on the ground floor of a large complex. I've always been fairly independent, and his absence wasn't anything new to me. However, in the weeks leading up to the events I'm about to describe, I found myself feeling more and more uneasy, though I just chalked it up to paranoia at the time. Looking back now, I realized that my intuition might have been trying to alert me to something off. This was just before Christmas, and even though the season was filled with holiday cheer, I couldn't shake a constant feeling of dread and sadness wherever I went. Strange things began happening, and I tried to rationalize them. The first was the nightmares. Sleep paralysis is something I've been familiar with since my teenage years. During one of these episodes, I found myself completely numb, unable to move, desperately trying to wake up. That's when I saw the usual menacing figure at the foot of my bed. A young girl, probably around 10 years old, dressed in a white nightgown, staring at me with black, hollow eyes. Her arms were at her sides, and in her right hand, she held a small teddy bear. She didn't speak or even cuddle the bear. She just let it hang limply in her hand. I eventually managed to break free from the paralysis, and although the image was chilling, I convinced myself it was just another sleep paralysis episode. I tried to calm down and went back to sleep, leaving a light on. That episode stuck with me, though. The image of that girl with the teddy bear haunted my thoughts for days afterward. Around the same time, I started noticing a black cat lurking around when I walked my dog. I've never had anything against cats, and certainly not black ones. But there was something unsettling about this one. It seemed ordinary, yet somehow off in a way I couldn't explain. It was far too interested in me. Strangely, I never saw it during the day. My dog was old, and I had to take him out several times throughout the night. Without fail, during our late-night walks, the cat would appear, trailing us from the shadows, keeping a distance. I love animals, so I know this may sound insane, but for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that this cat represented death. I even had this bizarre thought that if the cat caught up with us, it would take my dog's life. It was a thought I tried to push away, convinced I was being ridiculous, that it was just a cat. Yet I saw it almost every night leading up to the big event. Then, one night, a few weeks after the sleep paralysis episode, I was awakened by what I thought was the sound of my doorbell ringing in the dead of night. I wasn't sure if I had actually heard the doorbell or if it was just a dream. It was around 2:45 a.m., and my heart immediately began to race as fear crept in. I'm a very private person, and I don't know my neighbors well enough that anyone would be at my door at this hour, much less ring the doorbell. I'm not the type to have visitors, so most people didn't even know where I lived, let alone show up unannounced in the middle of the night. I got up slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible, and peeked through the peephole in my door. There was nothing there. Next, I checked the window, but again, nothing. I I was creeped out, but everything seemed normal. I told myself I had either imagined the whole thing or that there was some sort of malfunction with the doorbell. Even though I was still on edge, I tried to calm myself and go back to sleep. But then, oddly, teddy bears started appearing everywhere. My young niece, who usually preferred dolls or toy animals like dinosaurs, suddenly insisted she wanted a teddy bear for Christmas. It was strange, since she already had several, yet she kept saying it was the only thing she wanted. The teddy bear sightings continued. One morning, on my way to work, I drove past a pile of clothes scattered across the freeway after being thrown around by passing cars. As I slowed down to avoid them, I noticed one of the items was a teddy bear. It was dirty, crushed, and clearly had been run over multiple times. Its fur was matted with grime, and one eye was missing. Later, at a gas station, I went into the bathroom and noticed a teddy bear sticker stuck to the mirror above the sink. I think it was a Grateful Dead sticker, but it was still a teddy bear. I started seeing them everywhere. I tried to convince myself that it was just the frequency bias at work, that I was noticing them more simply because I was thinking about them. But then, one Wednesday night, I was once again awoken by the sound of my doorbell ringing, right around 3 a.m. I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or not, but my heart was pounding in my chest. I stayed still for a few moments, straining to hear anything, but there was silence. After a bit, I got out of bed, went to the window and checked outside. Nothing. I walked to the front door and peered through the peephole. Again, nothing. I don't know why, but something made me open the door. Maybe it was curiosity or the pull of exhaustion, but I stepped outside onto the porch. My gate was securely shut, but something next to the door made my breath catch in my throat. There, leaning against the wall right next to the door, was a giant tan-colored teddy bear, staring ahead. It wasn't new. The bear was old and worn, its fur frayed. A red bow was tied around its neck. It was massive, probably about the size of my waist. I had never seen a stuffed animal that felt so unsettling. I snapped back to reality and quickly scanned the rest of the porch and the sidewalk beyond. There was no one in sight. I slammed the door shut and locked it, still trying to process what I had just seen. What was I supposed to do? Call the police and tell them a teddy bear was threatening me? It would sound completely insane. I racked my brain, trying to think of who could have left it on my doorstep. My husband was 200 miles away, and I couldn't come up with anyone who would do something like this. Panicking, I called him, and he confirmed he had no part in it. No one I knew would play such a strange prank. Completely at a loss for what to do, I decided the best course of action was to wait it out until morning. Naturally, I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I had to leave for work and knew I'd have to face whatever was waiting at the door. I dreaded opening it and seeing that bear, its beady eyes staring back at me. In the daylight, it was clear this wasn't some innocent gift. There was no note or card, no explanation for its presence. The bear was filthy, its fur matted with dirt and dried grass, and there were odd red stains here and there. Stuffing was spilling from some of its seams. I didn't want to leave it there, but I definitely didn't want to touch it either. I decided to go to work and deal with it later. My coworkers reassured me that it was probably just a prank by some neighborhood kids. By the time I returned home, the sun was bright, and I finally mustered the courage to get rid of it. I put on rubber gloves, picked up the bear, and threw it in the dumpster, hoping I'd never see it again. Fast forward to December 23rd. After work, I stopped by the grocery store to grab some last-minute items for the Christmas celebrations before I left town. True to form, I didn't bother grabbing a cart, despite the larger items like packs of paper towels in my arms. Once I reached my car and clicked the remote to lock the doors, I realized I couldn't open the hatchback with my hands full. A man who happened to be walking by saw me struggling and offered to help. I declined, as I tend to be independent like that. But he insisted, and as he approached, I noticed he looked a bit rough around the edges. Dirty work clothes, messy hair, and a flannel shirt over worn boots. What really stood out were his deep, piercing blue eyes that seemed to look straight through me. Despite feeling uneasy, I let him help, and before I could stop him, he was already reaching for the hatchback handle and opening it for me. The parking lot wasn't empty, so although I felt uncomfortable, I didn't feel in immediate danger. I thanked him, quickly tossed my items in the back, and slammed it shut. He stood there, still, so I wished him a Merry Christmas and started walking toward the driver's side. He smiled, wished me the same, and then extended his hand to me. I didn't want to shake his hand, but not wanting to be rude, I looked down at it. To my complete surprise, he was holding out a tiny Christmas teddy bear, wearing a Santa hat. I was speechless. I didn't want to take it, didn't know who he was, and had no idea what to say. A flood of thoughts raced through my mind. Was he the one who left the bear on my porch? Was he following me? Was I just overreacting? He was still standing there, smiling, as though he knew something I didn't. Trying not to be rude, but completely freaked out, I searched for something to say. Finally, I just managed to say, "No, thanks. I don't have kids," so the whole situation felt even stranger. I quickly turned, got in my car, and drove off, keeping an eye on him through my rearview mirror. He was still standing there, glaring at me with an angry look as I drove away. Fortunately, my home wasn't far, and I got there faster than usual. The next few weeks were filled with heightened paranoia, but I didn't encounter any more teddy bears during that time. Eventually, I managed to stop obsessing over it. Still, every time I come across a teddy bear now, I can't help but feel uneasy. I'll never be able to look at them the same way again. Three years ago, I moved to a new city a few states down the East Coast. Due to work and financial reasons, I couldn't make the trip to see the place before moving, but since I was renting, I didn't think there was too much risk. It was mid-September when the movers came, packed up all my things, and dropped them off at the house. The landlord was kind enough to let the movers inside to unload since I wouldn't be arriving until the following week. It was a Monday evening when I finally arrived and saw the house in person for the first time. The place was a mess with boxes everywhere and furniture scattered around, but overall it seemed fine. The layout was a bit unique in that it was very divided. The house was a single story, with the kitchen and living room on one side and a long hallway on the other side that led to all the bedrooms and bathrooms. Since it was already late, I went straight to the master bedroom, started putting the bed together, and then shut off the lights and went to sleep. I didn't have a clock set up yet, so I'm not sure what time it was. In the middle of the night, I woke up to an odd sound. I thought it might have been something the house was making, but I wanted to check, just in case it was something I should mention to the landlord. I got up and walked toward the bedroom door. As I got closer, I realized the sound was coming from somewhere down the hallway. I opened the door, and the sound stopped almost instantly. The hallway was pitch black, so I flipped on the light, but there was nothing there. I slowly walked down the hallway and peered into the living room. It looked the same as before, but I turned on the lights to make sure. On the floor, there were footprints scattered across the boxes, which I assumed were from the movers. With no other signs of anything unusual, I went back to bed. It took a while to fall asleep again because I kept thinking about how the sound had stopped the moment I opened the door. I tried to convince myself that it was just the house making noises, but nothing seemed to add up. When I finally drifted back to sleep, it felt like I barely closed my eyes before I was woken up by a sudden thump, followed by footsteps running down the hallway. My eyes shot open, and I glanced over at my bedroom door. The door was wide open, and I could see clear footprints leading right up to my bed. I rushed out of bed, but by the time I got up, whoever it was long gone. All that was left were scuffed footprints from them running away. I grabbed my phone and called the police, locking myself in the bathroom until they arrived. When the police arrived, they found no signs of a break-in, except for the footprints. I convinced myself that maybe someone had accessed the house during the week before I arrived, but something still didn't sit right with me. After unpacking and checking each box, nothing seemed to be missing. It made me wonder what they were even doing in the house. But the biggest mystery was why they walked up to my bed and what that thump sound was just before they ran off. The landlord was quick to offer to let me break the lease and move out, as long as I didn't mention the break-in publicly. At the time, I thought he just didn't want to scare off future tenants, but now I'm not so sure. So, this first story isn't actually mine. It's my friend's. We were both in high school when this all happened. This took place in Florida, by the way. I already knew about skinwalkers and similar things, but when it happened to me, I wasn't sure if it was a skinwalker or something else entirely. What's strange is that most of the people who've told me about similar experiences live in my area, and my friend is one of them. His name's Jay, and he lives about 10 minutes away from me. Jay told me about a particular part of the bus route where they drop off a kid. She said there's something about that spot that just gives her the creeps. One early morning, when it was still dark out, they were driving through that area to pick up the kid, and suddenly all the kids on the bus, including the driver, saw this bizarre deer running alongside the bus. It didn't run away from the bus. It stayed right next to it. Jay said it looked so strange. It wasn't like a regular deer. It seemed almost humanoid, with its limbs bent in a weird way. Its eyes were described as freaky, too. The thing is, at the time, Jay didn't know anything about skinwalkers or anything like that, so I got a serious chill hearing this. I tried to stay reasonable, though. Maybe it was just a regular deer, and the darkness made it look off, right? Florida's not exactly known for that kind of thing, after all. But Jay was adamant. She swore it wasn't a normal deer. She said everyone saw it, and the bus driver even slowed down because everyone was so freaked out by it. It was pure chaos. Eventually, the creature ran off and disappeared. There was no way Jay could have made this up. She didn't know anything about skinwalkers or legends like the Goat Man. This freaked me out because I knew about these creatures, and here was Jay, who had no clue, just telling me what sounded like a regular story about some freaky deer demon. So I asked her if she knew what a skinwalker was. She looked at me and said, "What's that?" I Googled it and showed her some depictions of skinwalkers, and she said, "Yeah, that's what I saw, except it had the head of a deer." She kept saying it didn't look like an animal or a person, and after a while, the kid from that bus stop never came back. A couple of years before Jay told me this story, I had an experience myself. One night, I was sitting in my backyard, really early, maybe around 3 a.m. I was just thinking about stuff, enjoying the quiet when suddenly I heard this terrifying, echoing scream in the distance. The only way I can describe it is like a woman and a cat were trapped together in a bag, screaming as if they were being murdered. I know there are mountain lions, foxes, and owls around here, and they make some strange calls, but I looked it up to try to explain what I heard, and it didn't sound like anything I could find. You can usually tell when an animal is making a noise, right? It's just common sense. Like Jay said, this didn't sound like either an animal or a human. It just sounded incredibly unnatural and wrong. At first, I wasn't too shaken up by it. I was a little concerned, sure, but I figured it was far off, and I actually thought maybe someone was out there, like killing people or something in the streets at 3 a.m. The thing is, though, that sound moved fast. It was terrifying, and the closer it got, the more unnatural it sounded. It only took a couple of seconds for me to realize that it wasn't a woman, and it sure as hell wasn't a cat either. As I stood there, my mind was racing, trying to figure out what the hell it was. That sound went from seeming miles away to being right in my neighborhood in less than 5 seconds. It was bizarre. One moment, it sounded so far off, and the next, it was like it was right on my street. To be honest, I almost lost it. The second I got up to leave, the screaming just stopped. Like it cut off immediately. I was seriously convinced it was right outside my house at that point. I walked inside as calmly as I could and locked the doors. And just like that, the scream was back to being far away again. It was so weird that night, and it didn't end there. I've also heard scraping and tapping on my window late at night, usually around 2 to 4 a.m. There was one night, I was up working on a school project, procrastinating as usual, and it was already past 2 a.m. I went to wash my hands, and while the water was running, I heard scraping sounds coming from one of the bathroom doors that led to my backyard. Most of the door is glass, so you can't really see anything clearly through it, just blurry shapes. For a second, I thought I saw something pointy and ash gray scraping against the window. It looked almost ghostly, and I froze. I turned off the water and waited. Then the scraping came back again. My hands were shaking at this point, and I was trying so hard not to freak out. I even whispered, "What are you doing?" in a shaky voice. It stopped, and all I could hear was what sounded like footsteps by my window from time to time. This went on for several nights, hearing footsteps, taps, and sometimes I'd check, but there was never anyone there. Another night, I was sitting on the trampoline in my backyard, trying to relax after a rough day. It was around 3 a.m., and it was completely quiet, like a silence that felt unnatural, almost like a vacuum. I suddenly got this awful feeling like I was being watched. I snapped my head to the left and caught a glimpse of a humanoid figure, completely black, ducking under the other side of my fence. I was freaked out. This thing was pure black, like the streetlight nearby didn't even touch it. It looked almost cartoonish, like the laws of physics didn't apply to it. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I'd think I was crazy, but I've heard similar stories from other people around my area. One girl I know said she also heard tapping on her windows and even the same screams. What freaked me out even more was how she described it. She said it sounded like a woman or a cat, but not quite like either. Another friend of mine, who lives nearby, told me she saw dark figures in the woods and heard the same screaming. Pretty much everyone around here has heard the scream, and it's always the same. And that's the thing. What's really strange is that the experiences seem to take place in completely different time frames, yet everyone describes the same thing. It's unsettling because their voices sound so different, yet they describe it in the exact same way. After talking it over with a few friends, we all agreed that our town is definitely haunted, but I'm not sure. If there's any animal out there that makes that kind of sound, I'd really like to know, because it didn't resemble anything I've ever heard before. So, I guess if anyone has an explanation, I'd love to hear it. The only person I know who's seen something even remotely related to this is my friend from art class who was on that bus. Apparently, it's really bad luck to talk about skinwalkers, and even worse if you actually see one. From what I've read, they're supposed to be able to move incredibly fast, which made me wonder if that's what we encountered. But honestly, I really hope there's just some logical explanation that we're missing. I also asked my coworker, who was a friend of mine in high school and lives nearby, and he got pretty spooked. He said he's seen and heard the same things. He's very spiritual and often has visions, and he told me that he believes there's dark magic happening in the woods. He had a dream about a hooded group performing a ritual, sacrificing a woman and a cat or something, which is seriously freaky. What's even weirder is that behind our local dog park, there's this patch of woods with some really strange stuff going on. I was shown it by an acquaintance during my freshman year who lives a couple of streets over. If you walk down the path in the woods for a while, you come across this massive cross, just standing in the middle of nowhere. It's made from raw, crooked wood nailed together, with a rope hanging from it where you'd put your hands if you were being crucified or something. It's huge, and every time I go to check it out, I feel uneasy. Like if I stay too long, something bad will happen. It doesn't really look like a grave, but who knows? My friend told me that I'm not the first person he knows who's had experiences like this, and he's had his own run-ins with that humanoid figure. He said he saw it, and it turned to look him right in the eyes like it knew exactly what he was looking at. So, at this point, we all just agree to stay the hell out of those woods. To start off, I need to explain a bit about myself. I've always been the kind of person who doesn't react much to things. I rarely get shocked or startled, and my friends often comment on how cool and calm I stay under pressure, especially in emergencies. They think it's pretty amazing how I can remain so composed. As a side note, I've also frustrated a few people by not giving them the reactions they expected or wanted. For example, my best friend once refused to talk to me for a few weeks because I didn't seem to care that he was having his first child. We eventually talked it out, and I told him that, of course, I was happy for him. It's just not in my nature to get overly excited about things, whether they're good or bad. He knows me well and understood, but he was disappointed at the time. I'm not sharing all this to brag or anything, but rather to give you some context for what happened next. My grandma had lived in the same house for my entire 28 years of life, until about 2 months ago, when she moved out to a new house in the country. The new house is lovely, and I'm really happy for her. Apparently, she wasn't fond of living in the old house anymore because it was large and full of painful memories. My grandpa, who's a dirtbag, cheated on her and then left a few years ago, and it became a burden to maintain such a big house on her own. And, of course, there's the ghost. For as long as I can remember, my grandma has talked about a ghost that messes with her all the time. It's the usual stuff. Strange noises in the attic, basement and walls, voices, things going missing and showing up in odd places, doors opening and closing on their own, footsteps, and so on. She moved out pretty suddenly, taking only what she needed and leaving all her accumulated belongings behind, asking if my family could help slowly move the rest of it to her new house or store some things she no longer wanted. Being in college with some free time between jobs, I ended up doing most of the heavy lifting. A few weeks ago, I was at the old house helping with the move when I started hearing things. At first, I was in the dining room, packing up some fancy old china that had never been used. I heard the metal screen door to the garage open and slam shut. Thinking it was my mom stopping by to bring me some lunch, I called out, "Hey, is that you, Mom?" But got no answer. I walked to the other side of the house and checked the garage. There was no one there, and no cars in the driveway. The house was empty. I shrugged it off, thinking it was probably the wind. Next, I was hauling taped-up boxes of newspaper-wrapped china to my car. While in the garage, I heard a loud metal bang coming from inside the house. I finished putting the boxes in the car and went back inside to check. To my surprise, 2 of the floor-level cabinets in the kitchen were wide open, and all the metal pots and pans were scattered across the floor. Since I need to pack them up anyway, I just pack them all up and carry them out to the car. I'm still in the kitchen, and it's nearly an hour later when I hear something in the basement. It sounds like someone running up and down the basement stairs very loudly. The basement door is attached to the kitchen, so I turn around and open the door, flipping the light switch at the top of the stairs. The sound stopped when I opened the door, and I didn't see anything. Again, stuff like this doesn't really creep me out, so I just moved down the stairs to see if I can see anything. Nothing down there but bookshelves filled with cookbooks and boxes of old Christmas decorations and junk. As I turn around to go back upstairs, I hear and see a mop in the maintenance closet kind of jump out of the bucket it's in and out of the room like someone threw it. This was odd for 2 reasons. One, obviously, it looked like a mop hopped out of the bucket onto the floor by itself. And 2, the maintenance door was closed when I came in, and I didn't open it. I know it was closed because if the door to the closet is open, then it blocks the staircase and I didn't have to go around it to get in. So like the character from a horror movie, I walk over and into the closet to investigate. More confused than scared. Inside, I pull the chain to turn on the hanging light bulb to turn the light. After 3 seconds or so, I hear the light bulb pop as the lights go out and the door behind me slams closed hard. I turn around and calmly try to open the door, but the handle won't turn. It's like someone is holding the knob from the other side. Keep in mind this door doesn't lock. It's just a knob without a lock. I step away and after about 5 more seconds I say, "Okay, what now?" In a gentle, nonchalant tone, I wait about a minute more in the pitch black room before trying the handle again, and it opens with no problem. I step out, go back up the stairs, and go back to packing. And that's it. It's been a few weeks, and nothing has happened since then. I've been over there pretty much every day for at least an hour. I think the ghosts may have rage quit because unlike my grandma, I didn't seem to react or care about the stuff it was doing. In 2007, when I was 19, I moved to a coastal town in Oregon from Texas. My mom was relocating with my younger brother for a job and didn't want to face the move alone, so I decided to join her. By that point in my life, I had moved around a lot and wasn't one to stay in one place for too long. At the time, I worked as a pharmacy technician. I transferred my license to Oregon, found a job, and rented a studio apartment located in the basement of a large house that my landlady had inherited from her parents. She rented out rooms in the house to boarders. To reach my apartment, you had to enter through a side gate, follow a small walkway down a slope, and walk around to the back of the house. Upon entering through the door, you'd find yourself in a small kitchen with a window over the sink that looked out onto the backyard, which was enclosed by an 8-foot privacy fence. It was in this apartment that the strange things began, about a month after I moved in. One night around 11 p.m., I was washing dishes at the sink when my cell phone rang. Seeing an unknown caller, I dried my hands and answered. I said, "Hello," and was met with a strange, garbled voice making incomprehensible noises. It almost sounded like someone trying to speak underwater, but with a robotic edge to it. Assuming it was a bad connection, I said, "Hello?" again. This time, the voice clearly said, "We can see you in the window." Panic set in. I hung up immediately, locked all the doors, turned off the lights, and closed the curtain on the window over the sink, my only window in the basement studio. Then I called my older brother in Texas. We've always been very close, so I explained what had just happened. After talking it through, we decided it was probably just a prank caller who had lucked out in seeing me briefly in the window. It seemed too ordinary to be anything sinister. There was no sign of anyone in the backyard, and the high privacy fence made it unlikely that someone had seen me over it. Plus, this was a brand new Oregon number I had barely shared with anyone. I felt a little better, but I still didn't sleep well that night. In the weeks that followed, I started to settle in more and felt more comfortable in my new environment. I made a few casual friends at work, and my connection to the town deepened. There were no more calls, and I didn't feel as isolated anymore, especially with one of my new friends living just 3 streets away. But my comfort was short-lived. The unknown caller returned. Again and again, it became a near-nightly occurrence. Most of the time, it was just that same garbled voice, spewing nonsensical sounds. But sometimes it would say something I could actually make out, though it still sounded cryptic. "You think you are better than us because we do drugs? Set it on fire." Or, "We are your masters." I was creeped out, but I still tried to convince myself that it was just some random dialer getting a kick out of messing with a 19-year-old girl. I tried to move on with my life, but the calls continued for a couple of months. One night, I decided to step outside my apartment and go across the street in front of an old abandoned church to call my brother again. It was late, around 2 a.m., and the sound of my voice carried up into the house above my apartment. I would frequently have bouts of insomnia, and my brother was usually up, so I would often sit on the steps of the church and smoke when I made late-night phone calls to not disturb anyone in the house. I had been talking to my brother for about 20 minutes when another call beeped in. I checked, and it was an unknown number, so I told my brother to hang on, and I answered. It was the distorted voice again telling me they are watching me in front of the church and asked, "Who are you talking to?" Panicked, I looked all around me. I couldn't see anything. I switched back to my brother and told him what was happening as I ran towards my apartment. I got inside and locked the door. I stayed on the line with my brother while I searched my apartment, making sure I was alone. I thought about calling the police, and my brother thought I should too. But what could they do? I talked myself into it just being some weird game someone was playing on me, and that I had nothing to worry about. A few weeks went by without any calls, and after a bit I was sure they had gotten bored with the whole thing. I had been more cautious after the last call, but as time went on without any more calls, I began to feel more confident that it really all was just some harmless, albeit cruel joke someone was playing on me. So, one night, pretty late, I decided to walk a few blocks up the hill from my house to a 24-hour store to buy some snacks. On my way back from the store, I started to feel the late hour, and I stopped and sat on a bench near the library to take a bit of a rest and sip on one of the drinks I had just bought. Behind me was a street that ran along the side of the library, and my friend's street was just off of it, directly behind the bench. Within moments, a big man appeared. He was in his late 30s or early 40s, wearing heavy work boots, jeans, and a thick Carhartt work jacket, and a black ball cap. He sat next to me on the bench, a bit too close for comfort. I was nervous because it was the extremely early hours of the morning. Someone else just happening to innocently be there didn't seem all that likely to me. At the time, though, I was young. I didn't really know what to do. I was there too, wasn't I? And I wasn't up to anything. I wasn't sure if my discomfort was really all that valid. I didn't want to seem rude because in my mind, in all likelihood, he wasn't a dangerous person. So I sat there until he said, "Hi." I said hi back and scooted away from him as inconspicuously as I could. We sat in silence for a moment, and feeling like I could and should leave without it being too weird or rude, I was about to get up when he said, "Would you like to be my friend?" He had a light accent I couldn't really place. Nonplussed, I said, "Excuse me?" and he said we could be friends. We could go in the bushes. And he gestured towards this trail that ran behind the library that leads to a park on the other side of the building. It was enclosed on both sides by bushes that ran the whole length. At this point, I was getting really nervous and was trying to decide if I should just run for it and which direction I should go. My friend's street ran behind me, but his house was at the very end of the street and it was all uphill. I have never been very athletic, so I couldn't decide if that was easier or my apartment, which was downhill. I could go faster, but I didn't want him to know where I lived if he followed me. What he said next made me realize it was a pointless concern. He already knew where I lived. I missed you. I haven't seen you since the church. This is the guy that had been calling me. As quickly as the realization came to me, I sprung up, dropping my shopping bag. I turned and ran towards my friend's street as fast as I could in flip-flops with the guy right behind me. Even with the blood pumping in my ears, brought on by my flight and pure terror, I could hear him chasing after me, his heavy work boots hitting the ground. It didn't take long before I felt him try to grab me. In the chase, though, it ended up being more like a shove right on my left shoulder, and suddenly my feet were tangled up in my flimsy flip-flops and I was falling forward into the road. I let out an involuntary blood-curdling scream which seemed to have scared him, because the next thing I know, I hear his boots running back down the hill and off down the main street. I got up as quickly as I could and ran full force to my friend's house and pounded on his door. I could tell he was startled. It was the middle of the night, and I was out of breath, shaking and crying. Later, I would notice the blood. I had hit my forehead hard on the pavement when I fell, and it was cut badly. My joggers were torn, and my knees were scraped and bloody. I was so frantic that I couldn't even explain to my friend why I had shown up at his door, in that condition, at such an hour. He immediately called the police, and once I calmed down enough, I told them, and him, everything. The phone calls, the weird messages, all of it. The police drove around to look for anyone matching the description I gave, but they never found him. Nothing came from it. In the days that followed, I packed up and moved out of the apartment, staying with my mom until I eventually left the state a few weeks later. I just couldn't bring myself to stay anywhere near where all of that had happened. I don't think I could ever feel safe there again. To this day, I still don't know who that man was or how he got my number, which I had barely given out to anyone. One theory I've had is that maybe he knew someone I worked with. Our phone numbers were posted on a paper, pinned to the bulletin board at the office. When I thought about that, I realized the caller always referred to we. Could it have been him and maybe someone else from work? Was that why he said we when he called me? At one point, I even suspected my friend, the one I ran to that night, of being involved. Was it just a strange coincidence that the man came right to his house? Afterward, I was a mess, constantly second-guessing everything and everyone. Either way, I never saw that man in town again before I left, and I never received another call from him.